The protagonist observes some short, chubby, and adorable little hands. She wonders whose hands those might belong to, and time and again remembers they are hers. But she cannot get used to it. A woman approaches, calls her miss, and asks what worries her so much, sighing like this. The little one starts flailing her arms and legs, demanding to be released right now. But since she is the daughter born of a concubine, she must show proper bearing. Upon hearing she belongs to the imperial family, the child demands even more to be let go. We conclude that our heroine has reincarnated in a parallel universe as a princess of the Joseon dynasty. And to top it all off, in the role of the unfavored daughter of a concubine, many will believe that, being the emperor's daughter, a life of luxury awaits her. But with this little one, everything is different. Despite being a newborn, few want to take care of her. The wet nurse treats her like a princess, and a woman watches as if she were her boss. It is obvious that the protagonist does not have a very noble origin. The life of a daughter born of an imperial concubine is not easy. If her half-brother betrays her, they could execute her. But we doubt she has such relatives. Anyway, the baby is happy to be born into the imperial family and not worry about earning money. But now, the heroine is more concerned about infant mortality. Because of the modern language, this is not the real Joseon dynasty. The wet nurse asks the lady why she has that bitter look on her face. The woman loosened the ribbon at her chest level, and the baby knew she didn't want to see that. However, the wet nurse was very surprised that the little miss refused the food, because she was sure that she only wanted to eat. But for the baby, it is quite normal to refuse something like that. Besides, they were trying to feed her honey during feeding time, by the way. Apparently these ladies do not know how dangerous honey is for babies. The girl never thought that the knowledge acquired, while taking care of her younger brother alongside her sister, would be useful. However, he died in a car accident while returning home with his parents. The older sister worked hard to pay her parents' hospital bills, who were in intensive care, but they also died soon after. So, our protagonist was a high school student, making it very difficult for her sister. She had to take care of the youngest and even postpone her wedding, because the sister claimed she didn't care at all. The protagonist doesn't even remember the guy her older sister was going to marry. But every time he gave her gifts, he gave them to her too. One day, the girl received the script for a drama that was about to premiere. And that day, after leaving work, the protagonist planned to read the script when she got home. However, a truck that suddenly appeared frustrated her plans. Her last thought was what would happen to her sister, who would be left alone. Suddenly, the young woman saw her older sister taking care of her while she was unconscious. But for some reason, she was crying. But then, when the protagonist opened her eyes, she had been reborn as a girl in a world resembling a historical drama. A woman approached the girl, wanting to take her in her arms. She looks a lot like her sister. Who would have imagined that the voice of that concubine would be identical to that of her mother? Which sounds incredible right now. Due to her resemblance to the protagonist's sister, the heroine sees her more as a sister than as her mother. The little girl felt bad for having left her sister alone. It was as if something very important had been taken from her. The girl fell asleep, but she soon woke up due to voices in the room arguing animatedly about something. She was stunned when she heard her sister's voice, but clearly it wasn't her. So the protagonist didn't understand at all who was holding her in their arms. The servant June started begging to be allowed to take care of the little miss a little longer. However, the request was denied, as the concubine was sick after childbirth. Now Jeonbin will take care of and raise the young lady, so the mother can just rest. This woman never cared about anything, and now she pretends to care. For some reason, my sister seems like she's about to burst into tears. If she understood everything, then she shouldn't cause any more trouble. But the protagonist did not want that at all, so she started crying loudly. She didn't want anyone to take her sister away. The woman, with a motherly voice, was disconcerted and thought the little one was crying because she woke her up. She ordered the nanny to take the child away for the moment. But the little girl did not want to be separated from her sister, and she started kicking and waving her arms as she was passed to the nanny. They could not hold the little miss. Before falling, the girl saw an expression of horror on her sister's face. Although the protagonist promised to treat her well, she couldn't keep her promise in the end. But strangely, she felt no pain at all. The truth is that they managed to catch the girl. It was a boy, but the protagonist had no idea who he was. However, seeing the dragon design on the young man's clothes, the girl deduced that he was an imperial heir. His Highness was immediately approached and asked with concern if he was hurt. He calmly replied that he was fine. The heir was relieved that his sister was also fine. For just an instant, the girl felt relief, because now she noticed that the dragon design was damaged. Nevertheless, His Highness asked them not to worry, since his clothes had only gotten a little dirty, and that was solvable. But the protagonist knew that the servant who would fix that complex embroidery would not be happy. The heir called his sister brave. He didn't even shed a tear. He, as crown prince, was of a higher rank than the daughter of a concubine. He didn't think she would save him. John Bean asked the prince the reason for his visit. It turns out he came to see his younger sister, who had been sick and they hadn't celebrated her 100th day. But the prince almost witnessed a terrible misfortune. John Bean begged His Highness not to misunderstand. They were ordered to raise the girl, but the servant June refused to hand her over. That was the problem. Nevertheless, the prince coldly asked how the only princess almost got hurt. John Bean apologized, and the heir reminded her of the meaning of His Majesty and trusting her. The protagonist was curious about what he meant. Since the sister was frightened, the prince suggested leaving her with her mother for a while longer. The servant June. John Bean could not disobey His Highness. The little girl understood that the heir and the concubine were now fighting over her. The prince added that he himself could inform His Majesty about the princess's condition. John Bean promised to hand the princess over to servant June. The main protagonist began to feel the hidden struggle in the palace. A servant approached His Highness and reminded him that he was already running late. The little girl clung tighter to her brother because she didn't want him to let go and leave. The heir asked her not to worry, as he was going to tell his father everything. He handed the girl over to servant Jun and begged her to take care of his sister. The woman took her daughter in her arms, and tears of happiness welled up on her face at being able to touch her child again. Even after their parents died, the sisters remained together. The protagonist felt sorry for not being born an heiress, as she would have been treated better then. And her sister wouldn't cry. Before leaving, the prince asked them to take care of everything. Young Bin promised to comply with everything, although she remembered that someone else was also expecting to reunite with her only sister. A little foot touched the protagonist's shoulder, and a voice began demanding that she wake up. The girl assumed that it was her younger brother, Yunxin, who wouldn't let her sleep right now. The parents did not punish the child, so his two older sisters took charge of his upbringing. In the end, thanks to his sister's upbringing, the whiny boy turned into a heartthrob, but he perished in a tragic accident. Realizing this, the protagonist opened her eyes and saw an unknown boy kicking her to wake her up. He doesn't look like Shin, although he is also handsome. Observing the place, the girl didn't understand where she was. The lady who gave her honey and the servant who almost dropped her brought her here while she was sleeping. The boy, with a mocking smile, called her ugly and noisy, all because of her low status. The protagonist said nothing, and the boy coldly asked if she intended to ignore him. He abruptly grabbed the girl's hand. The servant intervened instantly, trying to explain to Lord Qianan that the princess was very young. If something happens to her, he could get into serious trouble. But the prince roughly grabbed the servant by the hair and snapped at her for daring to interrupt him. The servant started apologizing, but Qianan rudely ordered her to leave. Although it hurt, the woman did not make a single sound. The protagonist's whole body was trembling, as she didn't understand what she was doing in such a dangerous place. Yangbin entered, asking irritably if she hadn't said to take good care of the lady. Seeing the trembling servant, she asked Qianan what had happened there. The prince explained that he just wanted to play with his little sister, but a servant decided to get in the way. In a trembling voice, the concubine asked her son what he had done to that girl. But Qianan asked her not to worry, because this time he would not make the same mistake. The protagonist froze, not understanding what the hell was wrong with that guy. Yanbin began to explain to her son that he should treat the heir well, because he is still young. The prince agreed with his mother, but she reminded him that on the street he could not call her that. During the Joseon dynasty, the emperor's sons were born to concubines, and everyone had to consider the empress as their mother. Suddenly, Jeonggong innocently asked his mother why they had given him that thing. The concubine begged the prince to be cautious with his words, since that girl is still his sister. In the end, Jeonggong agreed. The prince headed for the exit and announced that he had to leave now. The door closed, and the protagonist felt relief. But she wondered what she was going to do now. It seems that Lord Jeonggong is uncomfortable with the appearance of the young lady. After the empress's death, he avoided women for years. And suddenly Seung Yoon appears. Jongbin revealed that they don't know what will happen after this pregnancy. Mystery looms. There were many pregnant concubines before, but none enjoyed his favor. None, because most suffered miscarriages, or the children were born weak and died. A cruel fate, but fortunately, servant Jun gave birth to a girl. A ray of hope. The servant told Yongbin there was no reason to worry. Jun was not the favorite, but it was obvious. If His Majesty had a living child, he would treat Jun well and visit her soon. However, since the concubine is in delicate health, Yongbin will raise the little one. An unexpected turn. In other words, it is the very concubine battle the protagonist heard about. As long as Yongbin raises the princess, she can use her to get His Majesty to visit. Once she gets pregnant, this child will be useless. The concubine asked the servant if she gave the girl honey during breastfeeding. She nodded in confirmation, but the girl refused to eat the honey, as if she understood everything due to her humble origin. In other words, they wanted to poison the protagonist by giving her honey on purpose. The little girl understood. She really could die if she stayed there. Our heroine wondered what she had done wrong in her life, since she had never offended anyone, and she even gave her allowance to those in need. Now, the only way to save herself was to punish Yongbin. Therefore, the protagonist burst into inconsolable tears. The concubine went into shock and, confused, asked the servants to calm the little mistress immediately. The little girl got goosebumps, thinking they wanted to kill her. The servants and the nanny wanted to call a doctor, but Yongbin exclaimed that this should not be done under any circumstances. The concubine ordered them to calm the child immediately, so that no one would hear her screams. She grabbed a blanket and suggested covering the child so the sound wouldn't be so loud. But Yongbin did not expect at all to see the person who had just entered. The emperor, indignant, asked Yongbin what she was doing. The concubine, in a trembling voice, tried to explain that it was just a misunderstanding, and that the lady was simply cold. The protagonist could not scream loudly under the blanket, but suddenly she saw the light. The man took her in his arms, and the little girl noticed a dragon design on his clothes that she had seen before. The emperor entrusted the child to Jongbin because he thought she could take care of her appropriately. The concubine tried to justify herself, but the ruler didn't even deign to listen to her. As soon as he took the princess in his arms, she stopped crying, which already caused some suspicion. Jongbin lied, saying that the lady just had a fever and simply wanted to check on her condition. However, the emperor did not listen and asked servant Kim to take the girl away. In other words, the protagonist is now going to be dragged away again. The little girl clung to her father and began to cry even harder. The emperor's eyebrows furrowed as he severely asked why the child was reacting this way to the one who had cared for her since birth. He ordered that Yongbin should not go outside for a while. The emperor sent for the doctor to examine the baby. Now the princess will sleep in the chimshin, that is, in the emperor's chambers. After the girl was taken away, she did not go to visit her. The empress lost several children and had to go through a lot of pain. But fortunately, she successfully gave birth to the current crown prince. And then the princess. Everything was going well, until the young princess died of an illness. The empress's mind and body weakened day by day. Then she adopted the son of a concubine, but he also died soon. The empress suffered terribly and finally died. There were many women who managed to conceive, but not all children managed to see the light. No matter how many children he loses, the emperor will never get used to this. As soon as night fell, he ran into the crown prince, who told him that he saw the youngest son today. The emperor thought he meant Kyungwon, but the prince was talking about the younger sister, who doesn't even have a name. The father reminded his son not to be too kind to his younger siblings. However, the heir explained that she seemed like a strong and bright child. But servant Jun's daughter has been sick since birth, so she could die at any moment. The prince said that, even though they almost dropped her, the little one didn't even cry and instantly recognized him as her brother. That's why the heir thought she was strong and intelligent. It would be better if the emperor forgot about this situation, but he didn't even imagine that Yongbin could do something like that. Being the adopted daughter of Counselor Hong Sangjo, Yongbin had a good status, and she even managed to give birth to Kyonan, the emperor's second son. Because Yongbin is the counselor's daughter, other officials also supported her. If this woman takes good care of the princess, everyone will praise her. But it would be better if Songbin, the birth mother of Kyungwon's third son, were healthy. The emperor suddenly took the baby away, so she will stay in his room tonight. How wonderful it would be if all babies were born as healthy as Kyungwon. The protagonist opened her eyes and wondered how she fell asleep, and it was already morning. Right in front of her, she saw dark hair over someone's face. The emperor noticed that the little one had woken up. The servants looked surprised at the emperor's chambers upon hearing the baby's cry. The ruler of the empire asked his firstborn why his younger sister was crying. The heir smiled and begged the baby not to cry. The protagonist's tears vanished instantly. The emperor arrived just in time yesterday, perhaps thanks to the crown prince. The protagonist couldn't hate her savior, so she crawled towards her older brother. The heir took the little girl in his arms and smiled broadly. Because of how the girl addressed him, it seems she remembered that he is her older brother. The emperor didn't understand her crying, but the heroine frowned. The heir assumed that the girl was probably frightened upon waking up in an unfamiliar place. But in reality, the reason the heroine burst into tears was simple. She woke up in the arms of a stranger. She couldn't see his face clearly the night before. The protagonist couldn't believe her sister was with a bearded man. She couldn't imagine it. If mom and her sister are identical, maybe that uncle looks like her son-in-law. The emperor didn't understand why the girl was looking at her brother without crying. And at him, the heir assumed that the girl had surely been scared by the beard. The young man remembered that the princess did not yet have a name and suggested giving her a temporary one. But the protagonist wasn't amused. She didn't want a shabby nickname, just a real name. The prince took one of the books on the table and proposed to his sister that she choose the kanji she liked best. In school, the protagonist got good grades in Chinese, but now she didn't recognize anything. She will have to buckle down on the kanjis if she doesn't want to be taken for a fool. There must be a commonly used kanji around here. Although the protagonist didn't master hieroglyphs, she at least managed to memorize her own name. Therefore, she pointed it out decisively. It turned out to be the hieroglyph for Xia. The emperor burst out laughing, disbelieving that his daughter liked precisely that name. But the protagonist was right with her choice. And even though the little one chose randomly, the name has a meaning. To create clarity, shortly after, a servant offered the lady something to eat. However, Xia flatly refused. The emperor didn't understand how she could refuse, being hungry and having tasted nothing. It's unlikely that lady would do anything in front of the emperor, but Xia won't let her guard down for a second, because she simply doesn't trust people. But suddenly, the emperor put the spoon in her mouth, insisting that she was indeed hungry. Xia eats but feels uncomfortable, because even though her father is feeding her, he is still a stranger. The emperor smiled. After all, the prince was right, and he continued spoon-feeding his daughter. Xia started crying again, and the servant explained that babies often cry and get angry for no reason. Soon, her ladyship will get used to everything. In reality, the protagonist thought her father was very cold, but he turned out to be quite normal. Several days have passed since they brought her here, but Xia's life hasn't changed much. Only a boring biological father, who plays with her without enthusiasm, and a handsome brother were added. But Xia was intrigued to know when she would return to her sister. The emperor noticed the little one starting to fall asleep. However, she woke up instantly upon hearing several voices in the room. The court ladies were commenting that the emperor had never been so kind, and that perhaps something happened in that annex. Now they are talking about the place where Yongbin lives. The women fell silent as soon as they noticed the princess had woken up. The protagonist froze when she didn't see the emperor. Is there no one else here, apart from these unknown court ladies? Xia started crying loudly, causing a commotion among the women. Terror completely invaded the little one. When one of the court ladies reached a hand out to her, the protagonist crawled backward at full speed. Right at that moment, a man entered the room and asked severely what the hell was going on there. Shortly after, the heir apologized to his mentor. The man was astonished to see the baby in His Highness's arms. The prince, with a smile, explained that it was his younger sister. A few minutes ago, he burst into his father's chambers as soon as he heard the inconsolable crying of a child. The court lady explained with sadness that His Majesty had left for a moment on business, and that the princess got very scared upon waking up. And that's how the crown prince brought Xia here. His Majesty also needs to rest, so the prince decided to help his father, and personally watch over his little sister. Although Xia came here by accident, she must not bother the crown prince because he is destined to be emperor. So the little one hit the book with her little hand, but the prince interpreted it as his sister also wanting to learn, and allowed it. The tutor noticed that the young lady was very intelligent, and the prince immediately boasted proudly that Xia even invented her own name. She looked at the book and pointed to the character she liked. The protagonist was sure that the tutor thought it was nonsense, But he didn't say it. Xia mentally asked the crown prince to stop, or rumors might spread that he was foolish. Suddenly, a man behind her smiled maliciously. Hearing that, the protagonist turned around. She looked at the man who was always behind the crown prince, but who was smiling in front of her for the first time today. Xia assumed he was the prince's attendant. All the warriors are old, and he is the only young man here. Unexpectedly, the crown prince touched the princess's hand when he should already be focused on his studies. Xia didn't understand why he started squeezing her cheek. She got fed up, so the little one decided to act. She sat on the tutor's lap and stared fixedly at the crown prince, who was now sitting opposite. Everyone understood that the young lady wanted the prince to pay no attention to her and focus only on his studies. As soon as the lesson ended, the instructor assumed that the crown prince's ceremony would be held very soon. When the location in the main palace was determined, everyone will have to prepare for the crown prince's wedding ceremony. Very soon, His Majesty will begin the selection to choose a suitable candidate for his son. The protagonist managed to get a lot of information in such a short time, but the prince begged the mentor not to talk about it, and the conversation sounded like a grandfather scolding his grandson. Nevertheless, Xia covered the prince's mouth with her hand. He is so young. At this moment, it's better to smile and nod. The heir promised his sister that he would only play with her. His Highness turned around upon hearing his father's voice. The emperor smiled, commenting that it seemed the prince enjoyed spending time with his sister. The father heard Xia crying loudly again, but the heir replied that everything was fine now, and he shouldn't worry anymore. He heard his sister's scream, so he went to her, and the little one stopped crying as soon as he took her in his arms. The prince was stunned when his father wanted to take Xia, thinking his son was tired of taking care of her all day. But the heir replied to his father that it was he who was surely tired, so he didn't mind staying with his sister a little longer. However, the emperor insisted, and replied to the prince that it was not good for a child to constantly change where he sleeps. But the protagonist doesn't care who she is with. The important thing is to be safe. Even so, if she accepts leaving with the prince now, she will feel sorry for her father, because he has worked hard to take care of her. It seems he has already grown fond of her. Besides, last time, Xia felt that everyone in the Eastern Palace court disliked her for some reason. Suddenly, the crown prince proposed to see who Xia would go with. This amused the emperor, as it was unlikely the little one would choose her brother, since he, as a father, put her to bed and fed her. The men sat in front of Xia and called her at the same time. The protagonist wondered what they were really doing. She still isn't used to having to do these things, but she crawled anyway. However, Xia cannot make such a decision lightly. The wisest decision will be to act differently. The crown prince's tutor, maid, and attendant were alarmed to see the princess crawl towards them. Xia decided to choose another person. The young man bowed and looked at his lady in confusion. The emperor and his son were stunned, not understanding why the princess had chosen that man. The attendant assumed that the princess wanted to escape from there. If that is what his lady desires, he has no choice but to obey her. However, the crown prince and his majesty are still awaiting her answer, so she must think carefully. Xia didn't understand why they were asking such a thing of a child, since she was still very young. In the end, the protagonist completely lost it and started shouting indignantly. The prince admitted to his father that it was the first time a child had scolded him, but it was new for the emperor too. Fortunately, they understood Xia's message. In the end, the protagonist returned to the main palace. The crown prince became sad after saying goodbye to his sister, but anyway, they will be able to see each other tomorrow. Now the emperor doesn't leave his daughter's side. Xia felt sorry for the court ladies, who had nothing to do with Jongbin, so the little one decided to be nicer to them. But a month has passed, and Xia cannot stay here forever. Although it is nice here, if the protagonist keeps behaving like this, she will never be able to return to her sister. After Jongbin took her away, servant Jun is so heartbroken that she has fallen sick again. The protagonist hoped her sister was fine, but the little one can't take this anymore. Something drastic must be done, so the emperor understands how difficult it is to take care of a baby. The emperor kept thinking about what to do with Xia. Since learning of her birth, the man tried to show her the least affection possible. The emperor concluded that he was a terrible father, incapable of properly caring for his daughter. If servant Jun raised the princess, she would have to treat her like a concubine, and the others would be kind to her if she received the title of Suk One, the lowest rank among the emperor's concubines. But the officials would object, and they would certainly cause an uproar. Since Yangbin couldn't take care of the baby, the officials are now busier protecting her. However, then the question arises, to whom do we entrust the raising of the princess? When the little one gets bored, she goes to her father and stares at the documents without touching anything. Xia just watches from the side, and the emperor can leave her alone in the room without problems. And she is so adorable when she laughs, but His Majesty doesn't feel like parting with her at all. Suddenly, the man noticed that the girl wasn't in her spot, where the little one usually sits. It turns out, she got up and walked clumsily towards the table with a vase at the edge. The emperor couldn't believe his daughter was standing right now. However, he then understood all the danger that lurked for his daughter in that instant. And he shot up from his seat. Everyone behind them shuddered upon hearing the loud noise coming from the emperor's chambers. The crown prince's tutor burst the door open and asked the armed man what was happening. But he witnessed something he should never have seen. In the end, the tutor called the doctor, but the emperor only cared about the princess. The tutor advised His Majesty to send the young lady elsewhere, as this was only the beginning. The first thing the emperor decided was to remove all dangerous objects from the room. The men sighed heavily, and the protagonist imitated them. The emperor asked, surprised, if he was the only one who had heard the princess's sigh. The tutor, incredulous, suggested to His Majesty to review the important documents before the ladies arrived. Thanks to this, His Majesty will be able to take care of his business. Xia saw a box and made a sound. The protagonist just wanted to cause trouble, but she never thought her father would jump and get hurt because of her. She felt so sorry for the man, because he is no longer young. After all, his joints are not what they used to be. The emperor decided to show his daughter the things left behind by the empress, the crown prince's mother. These were things she used to give him when, still crown prince, he went on secret outings with her. It seems he and the empress had a very good relationship. However, the man thought that to his wife, he had been a true sinner. The crown princess was chosen at a very early age, so many people began to watch her every move. The elders said that the crown princess had too soft a character, and the palace is no place for people like that. The crown princess endured palace life very poorly, so in the end she began taking the appropriate medication. In the end, she started having constant miscarriages, and her firstborn child died shortly after. Unable to fulfill her duty, she personally asked for a concubine to take over. Fortunately, the crown princess gave birth to a boy, so everyone thought the suffering had ended. But the heavens are cruel, and in the end the woman passed away. The empress, with her still young face and kind eyes, once said she wanted to give birth to a beautiful princess. If she saw this small and delicate baby, she would surely be very happy. The emperor assumed that servant Jun probably missed her daughter very much. Xia immediately made a sound of joy. The man kept wondering what Jongbin had done for the girl to be so scared. For some reason, the baby reached out towards the ceramic again. The emperor promised his daughter to give her one like that later, when she grew up. But by her look, you can tell the princess loved the ceramic. Perhaps the little one just liked how much it shone. Nevertheless, it is very dangerous for her now. So the emperor asked her not to touch it anymore. It's just that Xia still doesn't understand what she is doing. The emperor is this close to his daughter for the first time. Every action is something new for him. But one day, the old man declared that the position of mother of the nation could not remain empty, and they had to act. Hong Sang-ho, Yangbin's adoptive father, went to see the emperor. The empress's place cannot be empty. That's why the state counselor begged His Majesty to decide. But the emperor believed it was only his business, and no one had the right to interfere. Hong Sang-jo insisted. The princess started to wake up, and the emperor asked her to be quiet. They must have come here because Yangbin received her punishment. The elders interfere, accustomed to the previous emperor and displeased with the current one. Among them is Papyang, none other than the prince's maternal uncle. To protect him, they involve the Yangbin family, replacing that of the former empress. Even if the emperor elevates Yangbin to empress, the elders will continue to cause trouble. Hong Sang-ho urges His Majesty to give an answer. The outburst woke her up, and the little one burst into tears. The old man and the others were petrified when they heard it. Hong Sang-ho didn't understand that deafening shriek. The emperor began to calm Xia. In the end, the little one fell asleep again. Hong Sang-sho told the emperor that only Yangbin deserved the title of mother of the nation. We must make Yangbin become empress as soon as possible. Xia started reacting again to the counselor's voice. Once again, Hong Sang-sho begged His Majesty to make a decision. The princess reacted to those words every time she heard them. Finally, one of the heroes suggested to the old man that he should leave now. But Hong Sang-ho believed that this chaos had to be stopped as soon as possible, so they should hurry. That's why he repeated to His Majesty that if that title remained vacant, the people would be outraged. The protagonist couldn't stand it anymore, crawled towards the old man, and slapped the old man's face with her little hand. Everyone was dumbfounded by this. Then Xia grabbed Hong Sang-ho by the beard and started pulling it. The emperor took the little one in his arms, but she didn't want to let go of the annoying old man's beard. Once the girl finally let go, the emperor apologized to Hong Sang-jo and explained that she was just a child, but he said they should be quiet because the princess might wake up and start crying. Since the girl is in a bad mood today, the emperor proposed suspending discussions for today. The old man left the emperor's office. He was furious after the humiliation suffered. Hong Sang-jo thought it was Yongbin's problem, that she couldn't win His Majesty's heart. Even after giving birth, the man tried to give Yongbin a chance so she could take care of the newborn princess, thus improving her position. To frame his concubine, he wanted a capable child and adopted him. If Yongbin hadn't given birth to a third son, it would be much easier. Given the emperor's character, both Yongbin and Yongbin, mother of the third prince, could become empress, but she is from a common family, so the chances are low. Yongbin is the most viable option. Now Hong Sang-jo will have to wait and see how things develop until the fuss about the princess calms down. Those old men with thick beards return to urge the emperor to choose an empress. The elders usually come when Xia is still awake, but today they came while she was sleeping. Because of the voices, the heroine couldn't sleep well, so she slapped the old man. The protagonist is already fed up with all this. Noticing that the princess woke up, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. Xia looked at him suspiciously, not knowing how to interpret that expression on the emperor's face. But now she is more worried about something else. Where the hell is she? The old lady stood up and asked if this was the emperor's precious daughter. His Majesty confirmed his mother's words. In other words, the protagonist now has her grandmother in front of her. The lady took the little one in her arms. The emperor was surprised, as the princess doesn't approach strangers, but she went to her mother without any problem. His Majesty's mother called the young princess intelligent. Xia didn't know why, but now that lady seemed somewhat displeased. So the protagonist decided she should show how adorable she was and let out a joyful giggle. The princess is so sociable. That's why the lady doesn't understand why she is so afraid of Yongbin. Xia froze upon hearing her mother's voice behind her. That concubine has clearly been punished, although it seems the emperor's mother has called her. The lady suggested to Yongbin that she try to hold the princess in her arms again. Xia wondered if the emperor's mother was also dangerous for her. She moved away from the concubine and started crying loudly, and then extended her little hands towards her father to take her. His Majesty promised his daughter that no one would dare touch her while she was in the emperor's arms. Then the lady sternly asked Yongbin what she had done to the girl, but the concubine replied that it was just a misunderstanding. If the girl is so scared, it's best that Yongbin leaves here. But the woman tries to explain that Qianan was immensely happy when the lady and the emperor visited him. Only now, she realizes that little crazy one next to Yongbin. For this very reason, the protagonist breaks into even stronger tears. The emperor directs a stern look at his second son. Qianan flinches as soon as His Majesty proposes that he and his mother leave the room. They offered no resistance whatsoever. However, before the door closed, the second prince looked at the princess, and in him, anger and contempt could be read. The emperor will not be able to protect the protagonist every time she needs it. Then, the conversation revolves again around the post in the central palace, being vacant for a long time. These debates about the empress already tire the protagonist, so she decides to leave her father. Suddenly, in front of her, she saw women, and by their silk clothes, the little one supposed they were concubines. That meant her sister could also be here. Since Xia fears strangers, the emperor plans to send her with servant Jun, but her mother suggested handing the girl over to a concubine who already has experience raising small children. The concubines started smiling when they saw the young lady crawling towards them. The protagonist became discouraged when she realized her sister wasn't there. Suddenly, she heard her grandmother's question if it was normal to hand the girl over to just any concubine. The adults were startled as soon as the princess started crying loudly. The concubines were also astonished, since the princess had been smiling the whole time, and now something strange was happening to her. Xia felt sorry for the concubines, but could do nothing, because for her it was a matter of life or death. The emperor knew his daughter wasn't one to cry without reason. Suddenly, the boy informed his majesty that surely his sister was looking for someone. The emperor, perplexed, asked Kyungwon what he meant. The prince explained that his sister crawled towards every concubine and then started examining every face, as if looking for someone. The third prince's mother supposed that the young lady surely missed her real mother. The emperor's eyes opened in surprise. The woman decided to dare to suggest to his majesty that he hand the young lady over to Lady Yun's care. Surely the princess simply cannot forget the sincerity of her mother's actions. That's why she feels so drawn to her. The emperor agreed with Songbin and pointed out that she understood the princess very well. The main protagonist immediately understood that this woman was very good. Songbin pretends to worry about the princess, showing her maternal side, but in reality, she is just trying to score points. Jonbin, who took Xia away and failed miserably in raising her, to put it mildly, she ruined her, because Sonbin is a master at what she does. The maids were ecstatic, because the young mistress managed to take 7 steps on her own. Servant Jun tightly hugged her daughter, conveying all the joy and love she felt at that moment. After that conversation with the former empress, Xia reunited with her sister again. For this to happen, the protagonist had to crawl near the officials, terrifying them. They knew that if the mistress were alone, she would have pulled his beard off long ago. Then, Xia left her handprints on the documents and even tried to take her first steps. Although in the end she always fell, worrying all the adults. But the emperor always praised his daughter for her first steps. He was sincerely happy for her achievements. As soon as rumors spread that the girl was walking, they decided to keep her away from the emperor. Since Xia now had to live in another place, her sister received a new status. She became an official concubine, and now both her clothes and residence were very different. But the protagonist didn't understand how long she intended to keep her like this. One of her maids noticed that the young mistress felt uncomfortable. Jun apologized and confessed that she was starting to think she would never see her beloved little daughter again. The maid offered the lady a handkerchief, saying the child shouldn't see her crying, as she might cry too. The protagonist took the handkerchief and carefully began to dry her sister's tears. Jun smiled and said the lady had matured a lot. The servant reminded Her Highness that she must introduce her to her lady. The concubine told the protagonist that she was Ami and that she had helped her a lot all this time. From now on, she will help her too. The protagonist looked closely at her new acquaintance, and then her gaze narrowed and became suspicious. After observing her, Xia concluded that her sister had chosen the right person. Before, maids would pour water on Ami's clothes and make fun of her. And then concubine Jun called her and gave her a cookie. Just as the protagonist expected, her sister is great. Xia heard they were so close that when her sister was pregnant, she secretly visited her and gave her cookies. The heroine was happy that Ami worked there now, because her sister had become much happier after that. Perhaps Songbin was involved in this. Ami asked the lady if she didn't like the food, but the little one quickly swallowed it all, which brought a joyful smile to the maid's face. She seems like a good person, but can she live peacefully in this cruel palace? As the protagonist thought, soon other maids caught them. They were unhappy that Ami was promoted so quickly just because she knew Her Highness. The girls started doubting Ami's knowledge of imperial protocol. That's why they started thinking she might pass on her bad habits to the child. The maids acted so haughtily because they were sure Ami wouldn't dare tell Her Highness. Xia didn't understand how they could abuse a person, because before she only dedicated herself to eating. They behave with the princess as if she were a helpless baby. It's logical to ask what happens when they are left alone. The little one kept thinking about how she should act now. Quickly, a plan arose in her head, and the protagonist immediately stretched towards the soup bowl. She wanted those brazen ones to get what they deserved, so she threw the tableware at them. The maid screamed instantly. Min Sangung, concubine Jun's assistant, sternly questioned the maid about what happened. The young woman recounted that, upon starting to eat, the mistress spilled the soup bowl on someone. Fortunately, the soup was cold, because if it were hot, the mistress could also suffer. Since the princess is under Ami's care, she might be hostile towards those who don't treat her well. Min Sangung went to concubine Jun's chambers and found 3 court ladies whispering. The girls couldn't understand how much longer they would have to stay with the princess, whom they hadn't liked from the start. They only fell silent when Min Sangung appeared behind them. In the end, they hired 3 new court ladies named Beek, Walby, and Sukhwa. The protagonist knew this reached the ears of higher-ranking people, but it was resolved faster than expected. Before, those servants blamed Ami for everything, while having fun and doing whatever they wanted. It seems that this time they assigned decent servants, and if someone seems unsuitable to Shia, she will have them fired. Servant Beak asked the mistress what color she would choose today. The protagonist wondered if she should wear that skirt instead of the pants they usually gave her. It turns out Songbin is coming today, so Her Highness said to dress the young mistress in this. The third prince's mother brought some food with her. She is glad that the new concubine looks much better. Jun thanked Songbin with a warm smile. The protagonist wondered why Songbin had come, and with a gift on top of that. The woman pointed out that the young lady was also in good health. Zia was very surprised when the third prince's mother expressed her wish to hold her in her arms. Concubine Yun handed over her son immediately. Songbin introduced Kyungwon to his younger sister and explained that he must take care of her. The boy's cheeks blushed slightly, and he replied to his mother that he would. The protagonist remembered that it was thanks to him that she was able to reach her sister. Only one letter difference separates her name from Kyungwon's, but the difference between them is abysmal. Zia decided to give him a pat as a sign of gratitude. The women instantly started melting, and the protagonist didn't even understand why they looked at her like that. Finally, Songbin handed the little one over to her son. The concubines noticed that their children had become friends, but in reality, Zia was indignant because they didn't even ask, and the situation made her uncomfortable. Songbin suggested Kyungwon go out for some fresh air with the lady, as they needed to speak with concubine Jun. Shia didn't understand what they were talking about. They even asked the court ladies to leave. The protagonist was extremely intrigued. However, Kyungwon explained to her that they shouldn't interrupt his conversation. Lost in thought, the heroine noticed that, although small, the prince was already very handsome. Still, she couldn't stop him in any way, so she hoped to grow up soon. Kyungwon realized that his sister was nothing like a newborn. Apparently, she was very frustrated by the fact that she still couldn't walk. But when she finally masters that skill, her irritation won't disappear, because it is always very dangerous in the palace. So the princess must always be cautious in her actions and words. Kyungwon heard that the crown prince liked her, as her brother is a very good person, although it's better not to bother him. But Quinona is better avoided. Judging by these words, it seems the little brother suffered because of Quinon. Some time later, when Shia learned to walk, she understood the meaning of her brother's words. A dead crow was found in her palace garden. Ami immediately hugged the little one, preventing her from seeing the corpse. But Shia had already seen everything. Then, the court lady ordered Sakwa to call someone immediately to remove the bird. Ami took the young lady in her arms and asked with concern if she had been very scared. The servant was not very surprised to see it, as she used to work in the kitchen, so she knows what bird carcasses look like. In her previous life, the protagonist also saw pigeons run over or crash into windows. Therefore, Shia was not scared, but the scene was unpleasant to her. Could a bird have hit something in the palace and died? The next time, they found a dead rat. The court ladies were horrified and ran to find someone to remove the poor animal. Ami suggested to her mistress that they go somewhere else. A little while ago, everyone was in a panic, but they had already gotten used to it because this happened often. People said a human was behind these deaths, and the protagonist only thought of Kianan, but she rejected those thoughts, sure that the prince wouldn't do something like that in plain sight. Suddenly, a man appeared in front of Shia, surprised that she was already walking alone. The protagonist was happy to see the crown prince and Kyungwon. The heir was happy to learn that his Shia was already walking. He extended his hand and asked if the little one could also go with him. Of course, the protagonist could not refuse the request of her savior. So running, she jumped into his arms. The crown prince told Kyungwon that he too was a little boy once, and the third prince was surprised by that. A radiant smile lit up the heir's face when he noticed the clothes he had given her on his sister. Now everything made sense, because lately the protagonist wore more elegant clothes. The crown prince still worries about her. The older brother said that he and Kyung-won were tossing sticks into a container, and he proposed that she join the game. The protagonist supposed that was very interesting, but instantly looked at the third prince and noticed his face of displeasure. Surely Zia stole time that he should have spent with the crown prince, which is why Kyungwon was upset. The protagonist understood she had to give up her spot. Zia started struggling in her brother's arms, and he, sadly, asked if he couldn't have her a little longer. The protagonist pleaded mentally for the heir to look back and see her brother's bright eyes. The protagonist kept complaining, and finally the crown prince let her go. The moment had come, so Xia ran out of her place at full speed. The court ladies ran after the lady. She clearly shouldn't walk around alone. The crown prince sighed in relief, happy to see that Xia was growing up like a healthy girl. Then he sat down and proposed to Kyungwon to continue playing that game. In the end, Ami caught the protagonist. The little one was very upset. She wanted so much to escape and be alone. It's understandable that they watch her, but the heroine is annoyed by having someone near her 24 hours a day. Zai noted that it was the first time she had been in this place, where there had always been such a beautiful pond. She extended her hand, and Ami concluded that the princess wanted to see the pond. The rest of the servants were exhausted by the girl's resistance. Ami smiled awkwardly and decided to take the lady herself. As soon as they got closer, the protagonist marveled at the beauty of the place. Suddenly, she saw Kiana near that place. It had been a long time since she had seen him, and she couldn't even imagine they would meet in such a place. Suddenly, the little one heard a cat meowing. The third prince grabbed the pet and threw it directly into the water. Ami and the protagonist were horrified by such cruelty from the psychopath. From the strong fright, Ashia even got hiccups. The third prince looked back and asked indignantly who was there, upon hearing a noise behind him. But there was no one behind. Kenan grabbed a fallen branch and coldly said he was sure he heard a voice. As soon as the second prince headed towards them, the protagonist started thinking feverishly about what to do. If Kenan discovers they are there, the heroine doesn't even dare to imagine what he will do to them. She could try to scream for someone to help them, but there is no one nearby, so it will only make things worse. Xia froze upon hearing a familiar voice calling Kianan. It was Kyungwon, and the second prince supposed that something was wrong for his little brother to call him. Kyungwon asked the prince what he was doing there alone. The second prince asked indignantly what business it was of his what he did. Kyungwon suggested seeing the crown prince, who had a free moment, but instantly received a blow with a branch on the hand. The second prince coldly ordered his brother not to be so conceited. Kyungwon wanted to talk to his brother, but Kyungwon exclaimed that he was not his brother. He hangs around the crown prince because he thinks he can get something out of him. Kyungwon had finally found a good toy, but the third prince ruined the whole atmosphere. Kyungwon sighed in relief as soon as his older brother left. The first thing he did was save a cat from the pond. He promised that he would never suffer again. Then the second prince approached the tree and asked his sister and her servant if they were okay. So Kyungwon knew they were there. The second prince called Hassan towards him. The attendant took the cat from the prince and pursed his lips. Kyungwon asked him to calm down, as it wasn't the first time it had happened, and begged him not to tell mom anything. The little one extended her hand towards the second prince. Kyungwon dealt with that psychopath, protected his sister, and even saved a cat. And he was still a child. The prince asked if she cared about him. He explained to his sister that he was fine, and that he didn't allow Kyungwon to hit him hard. In other words, that was exactly what he was looking for. The protagonist didn't understand how he could talk about such things so calmly. Kyungwon, in a serious tone, asked his sister not to wander around lonely places anymore. Besides, that is a place that Kyungwon frequents, so it's better if the princess doesn't come around here. Now Xia understood why Songbin wanted to mock Jeonbin. That woman knew where her son was. Kyungwon wanted to play with the crown prince, but he had to come because he was worried about her. The second prince smiled and told her that she had that not-so-childish expression again. If he worries so much now, what will happen later? Kyungwon felt the desire to touch his sister, and she didn't even understand what was wrong with him. All this time, the crown prince was behind the tree, without our heroes knowing it. A few days later, Kyungwon asked the little one when she would finally learn to speak. The protagonist was indignant at that question. It had been days since he had been asking her the same thing. Your Highness, the first prince also longed to hear something from his sister, so he asked her to call him brother. In reality, Zia didn't want to speak because of her poor pronunciation, so she started hitting her brother in the face. The heir supposed that Zia was punishing her brother for pressuring her to do things. The third prince explained that his sister was very temperamental and always reached out her hands when you said something to her. However, with the first prince, she behaved in a completely different way. Kyung Hwan sulked, not understanding why his sister was so mean only to him. The protagonist stuck her tongue out at him because he should try harder. After the pond incident, Kyung Hwan started bothering her, even calling her ugly. Xia became enraged and reacted aggressively to those words. But Kyung Hwan is a good person, although he spouts nonsense that makes the protagonist lose control. Suddenly, Xia remembered that at this time, it is customary to call a child ugly. Now the protagonist understands that she was too harsh with her brother when hitting him on the head. The second prince flinched upon feeling the little one's hand on his head. He had the feeling that something was not right, but the protagonist found it an adorable reaction. Kyungwon started to frown, and Xia decided to smooth his eyebrows. In the end, both fell to the floor, and the crown prince, with a warm smile, said that they looked happy. Kyungwon asked his brother not to look, but to help him get his sister off him, because Xia already weighs quite a bit. The protagonist got indignant again. How could she be heavy if she had just learned to walk? But the heir took the little one and told Kyungwon to train if his sister seemed heavy to him. She is so beautiful. Therefore, the prince supposed that Kyungwon is so irritated. But hopefully the princess can speak soon, as the heir longs to hear her say many things. She thought about pretending she couldn't speak, but it seems she can't hold it in anymore. So with a childish voice, she said she had already eaten. Anyway, people might think something is wrong with her, but she wanted to speak when her pronunciation was better. The next day, the protagonist went out for a walk. After the pond incident, she and Ami only walk where there are many people. The emperor could appear at any moment near this building, so even if Xia sees Kyungwon, he won't touch her. The pond is another matter, where there was no one nearby. Suddenly, someone asked Xia what she was doing there. The protagonist only thought of His Majesty when he appeared right in front of her. The little one didn't understand what was happening, as she hadn't seen her biological father for a long time. Sadness appeared on the emperor's face, and he asked with sorrow how a girl could treat her father like that. First of all, the relationship must be improved. So the protagonist jumped into His Majesty's arms. The ruler pronounced with a smile that it had been a long time since she had hugged him. The protagonist noticed that His Majesty now looked much more haggard than before. Surely those old men bother him every day. Xia caressed her father, and the man was instantly delighted, understanding that his daughter wanted to comfort him this way. Although she is small, the girl already knows how to respect her parents. The protagonist flinched when the emperor asked Yongbin what brought her here. The concubine apologized and explained to His Majesty that Jeongun missed him very much, and she couldn't stop him. The second prince confirmed his mother's words. Jeongun's performance was amazing. Anyone would think he is a good and well-mannered child. John Bean suggested entering the palace, and she would take care of having something prepared for the princess. The protagonist understood absolutely nothing of what she was saying. The girl did not want this at all, so she clung even tighter to the emperor. His Majesty didn't understand why she got so scared again. He apologized to John Bean and explained that unfortunately he was busy today, so he couldn't go. The concubine understood that His Majesty was busy, but she wanted him to rest. Yongbin offered to take the princess in her arms, but the emperor replied that he had to calm Xia, so she shouldn't worry. His Majesty turned around, and Xia seemed to hear a grinding of teeth. Just as the little one thought, Yongbin and Kianan were staring at her. Tears returned to the princess's eyes, and the emperor didn't understand what was happening. But the look in Yongbin's eyes from under her brows sent chills down her spine. The maids told concubine Jun that Yongbin treated them very badly. All the girls' pimples were covered in scratches and bruises. It seems like a warning for the favor Yun received from His Majesty. Xia thought Yongbin would do something, but she never imagined she would unleash her fury on the maids. Ami explained to her mistress that it didn't hurt that much, so she didn't have to worry too much. Yongbin only wants to demonstrate her power, and that she can meddle in state affairs. But Jun began to get distressed. Because of her, Jeonbin might torment the maids even more. One of the young women suggested to Her Highness that she try to win His Majesty's heart, so that he would only visit her. However, Jun was aware that nothing would change, not even if she gained the emperor's favor. Lately, the protagonist feels oppressed, suffocated by this gloomy atmosphere. If she were truly a child, she would have found a way to cheer up a long time ago. Xia learned from the maids that the Cheondang Palace has a bad reputation, but the emperor never found out. So the protagonist needs to tell her father this somehow. Kyungwon won't be able to do anything either, since if he says something impulsive, he will surely face negative consequences. It would be strange if Xia couldn't speak, and suddenly, in 2 years, started to do so. No matter how much the protagonist thought, she couldn't find the answer. The court ladies noticed that the lady was bored, so they suggested going for a walk, and Xia accepted that suggestion. Zia, of course, accepted that proposition. And just at the moment when she thought her spirits were about to change, the protagonist bumped into a lunatic. Qianggong asked with a smile if it was his sister, since he hadn't played with his brother in a long time. The protagonist hid behind the skirt of one of the court ladies. The servant tried to explain to the gentleman that the lady was still too small for games, but he became indignant at that answer. He roughly pushed her aside, telling her how dare she block his way. Then, Qianan roughly grabbed the princess and dragged her, saying he only wanted to teach her a lesson. The prince's attendant stepped forward, but Qianan ordered him not to interfere and to stop the princess's servants. The girls were terrified, but they couldn't do anything. The attendant explained that if they screamed, they would only anger his master. However, one of the court ladies would not give up and decided to take matters into her own hands. She followed the second prince, who was still dragging the princess behind him. The protagonist was happy to know that at least one servant was following them, but she didn't understand where Qianan was taking her. Soon they arrived at the pond they had gone to the previous time. Immediately, terrible assumptions began to flood the girl's mind. She fell to her knees before the master, begging him not to do it, but Qianan only called her an idiot and asked how she dared to disobey. Only now, the protagonist understood that she was the girl Qianan grabbed by the hair. That servant tried to help her, knowing she would suffer the second prince's wrath. Qianan roughly pushed Xia. First of all, he decided to start with the servant's education. The girl crawled away, terrified of what the master might do to her now. Qianan raised his hand, shouting at the idiot that she must remember who her owner was. The servant closed her eyes, expecting the blow. The protagonist could not let this continue, so she rushed out and pushed the second prince, with all her strength from behind, something he absolutely did not expect. The boy lost his balance instantly, and the next second he was already in the water. Xia wanted to push the prince away because she thought he would hit the servant, but she never imagined he could throw him in the water. It seems the little one is stronger than he thought. The prince surfaced and the servant immediately asked His Highness, very worried, if he was okay. Qianan started calling the two protagonists idiots and shouting that he wouldn't let it go like this. The protagonist found it funny to see those furious eyes, but she had to pretend she didn't understand anything. So Xia started crying loudly, while the court lady called for help. However, no one came. So the servant risked a desperate step. Closing her eyes, she jumped into the water to save His Majesty's second son. In reality, this court lady didn't know how to swim, and now they both need saving. She did it so they wouldn't scold her for standing there watching. A short time later, the second prince's attendant arrived running upon hearing the screams. Both protagonists ended up on the shore. The protagonist's other servants also ran over, so she went towards them. The court lady hugged her mistress, assuming she had been very scared seeing the scene. Qianan got up and indignantly asked the idiot how she dared to throw him into the pond. But the protagonist really didn't want to do it, so now she didn't know what to do. Just then, salvation appeared on its own. Finally, the maid could catch her breath after running. The crown prince asked what happened, why Qianan was soaked, and she was crying. The protagonist wondered how her brother always managed to appear at the right moment. Next, she ran directly towards her brother. The crown prince hugged she, sensing that she must have been very scared. Finally, all that chaos ended after the arrival of the first prince. Although Qianan has a detestable character, he is not foolish enough to openly commit evil in front of the crown prince. However, revenge did not take long to arrive. Because Qianan cannot openly harm the princess, he decided to vent his anger on the animals. Before, he did it in a way that made it seem like the animal died alone. But now the bodies of the animals appear murdered in an increasingly brutal way. Xia began to worry about whether the servant would be okay. Most likely, he greatly angered Qianan by defending her. The protagonist didn't know if she could cry and complain like that to the emperor and the crown prince afterwards, because she wasn't sure the emperor would side with her. No matter how bad the prince is, for the emperor, he might be more important than the princess. The servant suggested to the young mistress to go for a walk, but Xia couldn't. She feared running into Qianan. So the court lady suggested moving away for a while and having a drink, and Zia accepted, since Qianan was far away. On their way to a safe walk, the protagonist witnessed another conversation between the emperor and the old man. Hong Sangzhou still insisted on finding the empress, and the protagonist was surprised by such insistence. Better not cross their path right now. But even so, a man noticed her. She begged him with signs to pretend she wasn't there. A smile immediately appeared on the attendant's face, as if he instantly understood what the princess meant. However, he asked His Majesty if he saw who was hiding behind the tree. The attendant explained it was the lady, but the emperor wondered why she was hiding then. The servant suggested that the princess had probably prepared a surprise for His Majesty. The protagonist started panicking when the emperor headed towards her. In his eyes, anticipation for something was clearly visible. Shia started thinking feverishly about what she could do for him, as they had only known each other for less than a year. An idea came to her mind, and the heroine had no other choice. She suddenly jumped out from behind the tree, startling the emperor with such a surprise. A radiant smile blossomed on the protagonist's face. The emperor, caught up in the moment, also started smiling happily. He picked her up in his arms, called her smart child, and affirmed that she was his daughter. But in reality, the protagonist was smart simply because she was already living her second life. The emperor ordered the old men to withdraw, as his head hurt because of them, and he wanted to walk with his daughter. But Hong Sang-ho reminded him of the planned coup he had revealed to him, thus offering him his help. His Majesty said he would never forget that help, and now he could behave like this. However, Shinjo was also considered a loyal subject before the coup. So now, the emperor learned a lesson. But the protagonist didn't understand anything about those secret conversations between the men. But one thing was clear: the official discovered the betrayal, and now he believes the emperor owes him something. It seems he doesn't like His Majesty's actions, because he looks as dissatisfied as possible. According to historical dramas, there is a theory that this old man might have framed someone else. But Shia couldn't know for sure. The protagonist fleetingly wondered if the emperor knew what happened at the pond. Looking at his daughter, the emperor supposed she was very tired after the whole trip. In reality, Shia wished they would encounter an animal carcass, so the emperor would learn about Kianan's threats. However, suddenly they heard an argument between the princes. Kyungwon argued that the second prince did it, but Kianan became indignant at such slander. The third prince remembered that something definitely lay at his feet, but Kianan replied that he didn't know what was there. The protagonist didn't understand why the second and third princes were arguing right in front of her house. The young men fell silent as soon as the emperor sternly asked what they were doing there. His Majesty ordered them to explain everything immediately. Kyungwon recounted that in the place where Concubine Jun now lives, animal carcasses were often found. The emperor looked at his son with bewilderment. That's why the third prince decided to investigate, and while inspecting, he saw Kyungwon near the palace. And then he saw the animal carcass, which lay at his brother's feet. Concubine Yun confirmed to the emperor that this was true. Therefore, His Majesty sternly asked the second prince what he was doing there. Kyungwon calmly replied that he had simply come because he wanted to see his only sister. Since he doesn't really like interacting with others, the prince only wanted to watch her from afar. Right now, Kyungwon is shamelessly lying, as there is no evidence against him. In reality, everyone suspects who did it. But unfortunately, they haven't invented security cameras yet. Kyungwon keeps silent because he understands that there is no point in saying anything. After all, the emperor doesn't know what Kyungwon is really like. The emperor reprimanded Kyungwon because he could not accuse someone without solid evidence, and even less his older brother. The third prince offered his apologies. A smile of satisfaction appeared on Kyungwon's face. Kyungwon flinched upon seeing this. Looking at his son, the emperor sternly asked if he now wanted to say something. The protagonist started waving her hands nervously. The emperor didn't understand what was happening to her. Surely the little one is acting this way because he scolded her older brother. Looking at the servant named Beak, the protagonist noticed she didn't look like before. She whispered to calm her mistress, explaining that Lord Kyungwon would be in another place today, and they only had to avoid him. Possibly Kyungwon made Beak take her for a walk, while he went to check on the animal. Shia wondered if he didn't want her to see the carcass. So now the protagonist has to take his side. Kyungwon apologized to His Majesty for causing him concern due to his recklessness. The emperor understood his concern for his sister, but everything must have moderation, so he asked his son to apologize to his brother. Due to a misunderstanding, Kyungwon caused problems for the second prince and apologized sincerely. Kyungwon knew that his younger brother sometimes acted foolishly, so now he will be more careful. But the emperor sharply told him that he had no right to criticize his younger brother. He has no right to enter here just like that. That's why those actions forced Kyungwon to be suspicious. The emperor reminded Kyungwon that he must behave as befits a prince. His two sons must return to their chambers and reflect on their behavior. Both princes offered no resistance. With arms crossed, Jongbin asked annoyedly if he was trying to get the emperor's attention by using him on Xia. Jun replied that her mistress had met his majesty by pure chance. Besides, she apologized to the concubine. Lately, Aunt Jongbin comes often just to cause a scene. Since the concubine cannot scold the princess, she decided to take revenge on her mother. Yanbin ordered Jun to take good care of the princess, so there would be no more fuss. Of course, since they don't have an empress, discipline and order fall apart. Afterwards, concubine Jun met Songbin, who learned that Yongbin had visited several times. The protagonist was happy that her sister and Songbin were getting closer. Young asked where Jeongwon was, and Songbin told her he hadn't left his room since that day. The gentleman said he cannot disobey His Majesty's order, and besides, he doesn't want to see that man. Xia decided to leave the room, as she had nothing else to do there. She quickly snuck towards the exit. The servant jumped up from her seat, promising their highnesses to bring the young mistress back immediately. But Sekwon allowed the lady to do as she wished. Even though Kyungwon was unjustly punished, he submissively obeys the emperor's order. The protagonist greatly wished to thank him when she saw him. Unexpectedly, Zia heard a familiar voice. It repeated the words of Confucius, that one must not harm anyone, as it is the beginning of the inevitable. The names of the parents will be passed down to the next generations. This is how children show their respect. The door burst open, and the princess appeared in the doorway. She smiled happily, because she had finally managed to find the third prince. Kyungwon understood that the princess had come with her mother. The protagonist stuffed a delicious snack into his mouth. As soon as she saw her brother, she was already covering his mouth. Chewing the sweet, the prince revealed that he didn't do it for her, but because terrible things are happening in the palace. In response, the protagonist tapped him on the head. Even though his mother yelled at him, he wasn't to blame for anything. Now it was obvious that Kyungwon had been scolded, and Sonbin didn't want the protagonist and his sister to find out. Judging by Sonbin's silence, it seems she doesn't want to anger the emperor further. Since Kyungwon hurt her, the third prince couldn't pretend ignorance and decided to act. The protagonist hugged her brother, and tears began to spring from her eyes. He hugged his sister even tighter. No matter how old Kyungwon is, he is still an 8-year-old child. Even though he did nothing wrong, his father became furious, something terrifying for the child. Xia couldn't imagine how difficult it was for the third prince because of Kyungwon. Kyungwon's eyes widened upon hearing the little one say that everything was fine. He abruptly pulled away and looked at her with bewilderment. The third prince was stunned to see that the princess could speak. The protagonist laughed happily and added that it was a secret. The concubines entered the room, where Kyungwon was now with the princess. Upon entering, the first thing Songbin noticed was her son, playing with the little young lady. Kyungwon froze, and his cheeks began to redden upon seeing his mother at the door. The concubine let out a happy laugh at this tender scene. After that, Songbin became even more worried about the princess and her mother. It seems the sister sensed something and decided it was better to be friends with Songbin. And no matter what Jongbin did or said, the emperor kept visiting them and being kinder than usual. The mother of the second son constantly threatened Jun, saying they would see how long she could keep her head held high. Of course, Jongbin reacted even more exaggeratedly, but there was nothing to be done about it. But at least Xia is glad that Kyungwon is still punished, and they won't run into each other. A servant brought her mistress a traditional Korean sweet rice drink and offered her to try it, but the court lady asked for some snacks to be brought as well. It would be great if they could eat secretly too. The girls promised the lady that they would return soon with something delicious and hurried off with the treats. Only one court lady stayed with the princess. She handed the lady a plate with a drink, but the protagonist had a little trouble lifting it. So accidentally, she spilled the entire contents. Xia looked with contempt at the servant, who should feed her and not give a ceramic plate to a baby. The court lady immediately apologized and began to panic. She reported that she would run for cleaning supplies and bring a new drink. All this happened because the protagonist officially doesn't have another nanny, and Yami has the day off today. Looking at her hands, Xia felt the desire to wash them. Suddenly, she heard a very strange sound. The princess felt dread when a familiar face appeared beside her, mockingly asking why she was alone. The protagonist shuddered and froze with fear. She didn't understand what Kiananaji was doing. The prince casually asked why she looked as if she had seen an animal. Not her brother. Because of his stupid behavior, he was punished. But the princess was born from a commoner, so not much more could be expected. Today, the second prince brought his sister a generous gift, so now she should be grateful. Hippo came over to Shia as soon as a mutilated bird carcass flew nearby. That psychopath just did that. It seems Kianan is so sure that they won't catch him, and no one will notice. For the second prince, this spectacle was perfect, because normally Shia is brave, but now she is scared. He asked her if she thought that she and he were of the same status, because the same thing will soon happen to her as happened to the bird. And then the second prince rushed out, reaching out towards the princess. However, the protagonist quickly grabbed an empty plate and hit Kianan on the head with all her might. The second prince immediately grabbed his forehead and called his sister an idiot. Now the protagonist has an excellent opportunity to use her secret weapon and get rid of this psychopath. With all her might, Zia shouted. The maids heard this sound immediately and ran towards their mistress. The second prince cursed under his breath and hurried to slip away before being seen. When the court ladies returned with the princess, they were horrified to see a bloody bird next to her, and the young lady herself was covered in blood. The emperor didn't understand who had dared to harm the princess in the palace. Kneeling, Concubine June began to implore His Majesty to find whoever dared to threaten the princess. Out of sheer rage, the emperor clenched his jaw. He promised to conduct a thorough investigation and catch the culprit. In addition, palace security would be reinforced, so the emperor asked Jun not to worry and to go rest with the princess. Due to the investigation of this incident, all the palace servants entered a difficult period of their lives. But unfortunately, no one managed to discover that the culprit was Kianan. Since Kianan is so small, his voice sounded like a woman's, so the suspects were only the court ladies. The investigation caused several innocent servants to suffer the consequences. My sister was so shocked by everything that she had to beg His Majesty to stop the investigation. Such an unpleasant incident occurred, and it's a pity that they haven't found the culprit. Songbin reminded the concubine that she could now enjoy His Majesty's favor. He even promoted Young in rank, which infuriated Yongbin so much that even the servants were afraid to pass by her room. At that moment, the emperor appeared and asked why they were so happy. And so this idyllic situation continued for a while longer. But the problem is that the position of empress is still vacant, and that means they are worried about it in the main palace. The officials use the empress's absence as an excuse every time problems arise. Zia couldn't even imagine what would happen to Kianan if she suddenly revealed that he is the one killing the animals. But the emperor and everyone else has to know what the second prince is doing, whether they like it or not. Now all that remains is to devise a way to achieve it. The protagonist didn't understand why the emperor simply didn't see it. What is Kianan really like? His Majesty informed his daughter that it was time for her to learn to speak. First, he suggested the princess try calling him father. Concubine Yun informed the emperor that they went to the doctor, and he said there is no problem, that they shouldn't worry. If that's true, the man is happy, but he would still like to hear his little daughter call him father. Shia began to struggle, which meant she wanted to leave. Since Yun honored him with her visit, the emperor suggested they take a walk together. Concubine Yun couldn't refuse such an offer. Shortly after, the protagonist had the opportunity to report Kianan's atrocities. The emperor and concubine Yun went for a walk, holding the princess's hands. The weather is nice, so the protagonist longs to go to an unknown place. Being with the emperor, there is no place she cannot go. But Zia suddenly remembered that the punishment for Kyungwon and Kyungwon was recently revoked. Therefore, the little one came up with a brilliant idea. Yongbin flinched upon seeing the emperor and Yun with the princess. Noticing the concubine, His Majesty asked her what she was doing there, and she replied that she was just taking a walk. She didn't plan to meet the ruler in this place. Normally, Yongbin is always happy to see His Majesty, but today she seems worried. That means she is hiding something. For example, what is Kianan up to right now? Yongbin told the emperor that today was a perfect day to enjoy a walk. Suddenly, the protagonist ran out and headed towards the pond. Yongbin immediately informed the emperor that she wanted to tell him something important. If the second prince often comes to the pond, it means he is here right now. Kianan turned when he heard a noise behind him. Seeing the princess, he immediately rejoiced, because this fool came alone to seek her punishment. The prince indignantly asked if she realized what had happened to him because of that day. The protagonist was happy to see Kianan's swollen face after hitting him with a ceramic plate. Kianan still hadn't gotten over that situation, so the idiot appeared just in time. This time, he will definitely teach her a lesson. The protagonist was sure they were looking for her. Among the bushes, she spotted a familiar old man. The second one roughly grabbed the princess by the neck and asked how she dared to ignore him so insolently. Suddenly, Shia asked if he really thought he would become someone important. Kianan flinched upon hearing his sister's voice for the first time. The protagonist reminded him that not even his mother can be empress, so he won't achieve anything either. Although he said she was born from a commoner, in the end, both were born from a concubine. In other words, Kianan is also the son of a mere concubine. Even if they find out that he tortures animals, the prince will surely get off lightly. That's why Shia has no choice but to provoke him. Kianan roughly grabbed the protagonist by the neck, and the next second, she was already flying towards the pond. Shia began to sink rapidly in the water. She felt pain, although she thought none of that would happen. She must calm down and try to surface. They are far away, and it will take time to rescue her. But her wet clothes weighed her down, and now the protagonist couldn't get up. Consciousness began to abandon her, and she silently begged someone to save her. Someone grabbed her hand, and in a matter of seconds, the protagonist was safe on the shore. The first thing Shia saw was Jeongwon's tearful face. She touched him, silently asking him to stop crying, because it hurt her to see him like that. Shia still didn't understand who had rescued her. It turned out to be the crown prince who asked her, relieved, if she knew how much he had suffered. Shortly after, the adults rushed over with the children. The crown prince demanded that His Majesty call a doctor immediately. For Jeongwon, something had clearly gone terribly wrong. The protagonist's body felt heavy, as her plan had required more strength than expected. But apparently, her efforts were not in vain. Shia reached out her hand to His Majesty and softly called him father. And then, the little one lost consciousness, without seeing the emperor's expression of surprise. Yongbin exclaimed that this couldn't stand. That last time they falsely accused her son. And the story was repeating itself. Shia woke up to those shouts and felt like her head was exploding. Seong Bin reminded His Majesty that Yongwon had always taken care of the princess and couldn't do anything in that horrible situation. Yongbin started getting even more indignant, because now they are shamelessly accusing Yongwon of intentionally harming the young lady. The emperor's head was starting to hurt from all those arguments. It seems they didn't find out that Yongwon threw her into the water. Seeing that the young lady had regained consciousness, they immediately informed His Majesty, and the emperor was instantly cheered up. He took her in his arms and asked her concernedly if she was okay. But the protagonist obviously wasn't okay. She had to live through that nightmare. And no one noticed it, which is unfair on the part of the adults. Shia burst into tears, pointed her finger at Kianan, and called him mean. The emperor clearly ignored him, happier that his only daughter started talking. So she really did call him daddy last time. The protagonist didn't think she would like it so much. Kyong-won raised his voice, telling His Majesty that he had heard Shia speak before. The protagonist froze, not understanding what else her brother was going to say. Kyong-won revealed that, because his brother was upset, that Shia called him informally. He taught her the word brother, but since that word was complicated for her, she preferred to remain completely silent. Now, the emperor began to think that Kianan threw his sister into the pond on purpose. For calling him brother, the second prince immediately exclaimed that this was entirely false. She clearly insulted him and Yonbin, so he became furious. The emperor couldn't believe his son could throw his little sister into the pond just because he offended him. Kianan continued to deny his guilt, and then His Majesty asked him if he could stand by his words. Upon an affirmative answer, a servant entered the room. The emperor ordered him to repeat what he had already told him before. The old man revealed that before the young lady fell into the pond, Kianan was near her. Since it was just the two of them, he thought he should watch them. But then Kianan said something to the young lady and grabbed her by the neck. The old man, terrified, ran to find His Majesty. The man fell to his knees, saying he never imagined anything bad would happen so quickly. The emperor coldly asked his son if he would continue to deny everything. Kianan tried to convince the emperor that she was talking about him. No one can insult the prince. How dare someone born from a concubine say such things to him? The emperor exclaimed furiously, asking who told him that. He ordered Yongbin to answer immediately, instead of her son. The woman, with a trembling voice, replied that perhaps the prince overheard the ladies talking about it. The emperor believed that Yongbin raised Kianan well, but today it seems that is not the case. His Majesty is very disappointed with the concubine. Finally, after this incident, Songbin takes the position of empress. From now on, Xia must call her brother Yongwon, not Kyungwon. Songbin is empress. Kyungwon will be called Grand Lord. Anyway, the third prince feels immense relief. He asks his sister if she now understands the danger she was in that day. No one could find her. It's a good thing her brother assigned her a guard, or she would be in trouble. Xia understands everything now. She wondered how those two found her. After all, it's nice that someone cares about you. Following Songbin's ascension to the throne, the palace was turbulent for a while. It seems the third prince's mother decided to seize her opportunity. Many maids began to be dismissed, and one day the protagonist saw a familiar girl. It was the same servant who had saved her twice. The protagonist immediately ran towards her savior. She confidently told the court ladies that this girl was not bad and that she had already saved her several times. The servant couldn't believe her mistress remembered her, but Xia couldn't forget her kindness in any way. However, she didn't even imagine that her action would have such consequences. Songbin found out that Qianan had also threatened the young mistress before, but Jun, for some reason, remained silent. Xia's mother told her that she had a younger sister living outside the palace, and that Anan started threatening her. John only cared about his sister. That's why he couldn't tell His Majesty anything. The protagonist remembered that among the literature she had read, there was a similar plot. In the novel, the court lady was a minor character, and she only sought revenge on the prince who killed her sister. Xia loved that novel, but she forgot the court lady's name. The empress asked the servant her name, and the girl said her name was Soga. The protagonist froze instantly, because that was the name. She didn't understand why it was exactly the same name. Xia couldn't believe this was possible, so she thought it was just a coincidence. Although, the more she thinks, the more the characters from the novel of the past resemble the people here. But it's impossible for a person to end up inside a novel. It was a court romance. The protagonist was a man named Li Hua, whose life and path to the throne formed the basis of the plot. Among the characters, Cho Ga-ya stood out, sharpening a knife to avenge her younger sister. After gathering evidence for the accusation, she lured the prince to her sister's tomb. And there, she plunged the knife into his back. This was a vivid depiction of righteous revenge and the culmination of the entire work. It was precisely thanks to this that the protagonist was able to obtain the title of Crown Prince. Our heroine was a fan of this work since its publication and eagerly awaited for this scene to be shown in the drama. The girl was rushing home to finish reading the script she had been gifted, when suddenly a car hit her as she ran out onto the road. Unexpectedly, the Crown Prince asked why his Xia had such a serious face. Yangwon asked with discontent how she could behave so carelessly in the presence of the Crown Prince. But the heir asked Xia not to get so angry. Even though he says those things, Grand Prince Yangwon actually cares about her. Somewhere, the protagonist had already heard that way of addressing her, so she asked the third prince what his name was. She had already found out that Prince Yangwon had another name. Apparently, someone had told her. The protagonist's eyes widened upon learning that her brother was actually named Li Hua. The Crown Prince laughed softly and said that his brother's name was beautiful, and the name of the Crown Prince himself is Li Hai. In other words, the protagonist of the story is right in front of Xia, which is mind-blowing. That is, it's not a reincarnation, but something like entering a book. Even though Xia is in another body, she already died in her past life, and there is no trace that she can return. Several years have passed, and now Grand Prince Yangwon has turned 12. The Crown Prince was already 20 years old. On a hot day, the heroes were on a lookout point, and Xia was telling them a horror story. It was so convincing that the third prince immediately believed her words. Li Hua even squealed from the emotional overload. He didn't understand how his little sister wasn't afraid, since she is only 6 years old now. The third prince blushed when the protagonist told him that he simply lacked courage. It was very hot, but reputation matters, so Xia couldn't even roll up her dress sleeves. Li Hua didn't understand how she could behave like that in front of the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince picked up the little one, and with a soft laugh replied that it was a privilege of the youngest. 4 years have passed since the heroine realized she was in a book, and she has already gotten used to this life. The third prince asked the Crown Prince if lately he couldn't be separated from Xia. Li Hei replied that when she grows up a little, they won't be able to interact so closely. If we follow the original story, Grand Prince Li Hua should be the Crown Prince. But now someone else has that title, so the protagonist doesn't understand what is happening. Xia decided to reflect once more on how the story was in the original. For some reason, She vaguely remembers the title of Grand Prince Yongwon and the villain Prince Jinan, unable to accept his younger brother. The reason Grand Prince Yongwon was able to become heir was the death of the previous crown prince, and the one who did that to Li Hai was Yongbin. However, despite everything, it wasn't her who became queen, but Sonbin, whom Yongbin also poisoned. But all her efforts were in vain, as the king chose another concubine for the position of empress. In the end, Yongbin only did a favor to others. In the novel, Qianan and his mother were a sort of final bosses, but here they turned into pathetic comet remnants, and it was she who led them to ruin. Because of her, many things in the plot have already changed. Yongbin was placed under an indefinite ban from leaving, and she, along with Prince Qianan, are under house arrest. The chief counselor resigned, feeling guilty for not raising the woman well. Thanks to this, peace reigned in the country for several years, except that the crown princess, who had recently married, passed away a few years later. Since Li Hai started speaking little, everyone started worrying, but then he began sneaking out of the palace. The third prince started teaching his sister to trace Chinese characters and to read them, but she didn't want to learn. In reality, studying isn't that bad. It's just that she doesn't know how much she needs to try. A servant approached the crown prince and informed him, "It's time to leave." Laya took his sister down and explained to her, she has to go to work now. The third prince found it amusing that Zia continued to act like a saint in front of the heir. The protagonist exclaimed that they were the same then and ran out. Yongbin followed her and asked, annoyed, couldn't she have a little decorum? In the end, they managed to escape the servants. The protagonist found out that lately her brother has been dedicating himself a lot to studying. Li Huanho understood where those rumors came from, and the little one told him that there are no secrets in the palace. Xia assumed that it was all because of His Majesty. The prince confirmed her words, as when he wanted to learn martial arts, his mother became a little distressed. It seems the empress fears that Grand Prince Yongwon will look like a threat to the heir. Furthermore, the protagonist found out that the selection of the crown princess will be held soon. So that his mother wouldn't worry, the third prince decided to dedicate himself discreetly to studying for now. Some time passed, and boredom started taking over the protagonist. If the young lady was sad, Cho Gabon suggested the princess play some game. Being born into the imperial family is fun, but compared to her previous life, there aren't that many distractions. Xia decided to bring some sweets to her father and brother. They will surely be very happy. The protagonist came up with an idea to carry this all out, so she suggested to the servant to go to the pastry shop, where they prepare various desserts, including sweets and cold dishes. Thus began the preparation of Xia's dessert. After a while, the delicate pudding was ready. The protagonist failed several times due to the fire, but in the end, it turned out the way she wanted. Concubine Jun tasted the dessert and admitted that she never thought that combination of ingredients could be delicious. Xia recounted how she didn't even know how many times she tried to make it so soft, and when she succeeded, she immediately ran to her mother. She was stunned to see the change in her mother's face. The woman covered her mouth, her gaze became agitated, but the very next moment a smile appeared on the concubine's face, and she told her daughter that nothing serious had happened to her. Due to the eggs, the dessert had a strange raw taste, so the concubine suggested to her daughter to add some fruit syrup. When June lived in the women's quarters, she secretly prepared sweets and shared them with her friends. In her childhood, sweets were a dream, so the heroine used to steal treats from the women's quarters. She had no family and wandered from relative's house to relative's house until she ended up in the palace service. Contact with her relatives soon broke off, but she did have a close friend, more than family. When her relatives had no food, she secretly shared her ration with Jun, even if it meant going hungry. One day, her friend promised to grow up, earn money, and come back to feed her until she was full. But then she disappeared. Later, Jun also entered the palace as a servant, without fulfilling her promise to meet her again. One day, a man came to the palace and posed as her cousin. Xia paused to think, could there be some kind of affection between them? Jun strictly forbade the young mistress from ever mentioning the topic again. The heroine remembered that when Jun was a palace lady, someone posed as a relative and came to the palace. Xia was very happy to see her older brother. He, along with his attendant, greeted the young lady. The protagonist explained to the crown prince that she had prepared something delicious and wanted to take it to the empress. Li Hai also became curious to know what she had prepared. Xia promised to invite him next time, and the prince nodded, telling her that now he was going to practice archery. The crown prince promised to teach his sister too, as soon as she grew up a little more. The protagonist was happy and said that starting to learn some skill from childhood wasn't so bad. Li Hai was going to archery with Grand Prince Yongyuan, but it turned out he won't be able to today. As soon as the protagonist entered the palace, she heard shouts between the empress and the third prince. Zia understood that she had chosen the worst possible moment. She was already about to leave when the third prince came out of his mother's office. Without saying a word, he ran off in a hurry. The protagonist entered the empress's office and greeted Her Highness. Songbin was happy and asked the young lady to come in. Xia offered the woman her dessert, and the empress immediately appreciated its soft sweetness. The protagonist recounted that she plans to study little by little, so that it is safe. The empress knew that the princess was still learning to write too. Xia confirmed her words and said that the crown prince promised to teach her horseback riding and archery. Noticing the empress's strange reaction, the heroine asked if that was somehow impossible. Songbin did not allow her son to learn that, so she couldn't simply allow it for the princess. She tried to explain that it was dangerous, but the protagonist retorted that with the crown prince there would be many guards. So Zia opted to ask His Majesty if Grand Prince Jiangwu could also study. Li Hua was sitting by the edge of the pond when the protagonist found him. He didn't doubt for a second that his sister had heard everything. Since his mother became empress, the prince felt that she had become colder. Since Zia had obtained permission from Her Majesty, she suggested to her brother that they go learn archery and horse riding. Li Hua couldn't understand how Zia had achieved such a thing. The protagonist replied with a smile that this is where the power of bribery lay. The crown prince asked his sister not to get distracted and to concentrate on the horse. Xia felt no fear because she couldn't lose to Grand Prince Jiangwu, who was visibly terrified. Li Hua exclaimed that he feared absolutely nothing. It's a good thing he wasn't the crown prince. He couldn't rule a country with that naivety. To think that this innocent child became so cold and distant in the novel. Wow, the environment really influences people. But now the Grand Prince has no chance of meeting the protagonist of the novel. She was supposed to coincidentally meet Lijua upon arriving at the palace to introduce herself to the Empress as a potential princess. However, that girl is too young now. Xia wondered if it was because of her that the protagonists wouldn't meet. Although maybe it's better if they don't meet, then they will live a quiet and uneventful life. After class, the crown prince accompanied the princess. The protagonist worried whether the heir had time for that, with the servants following them so tensely. The protagonist starts suspecting that her older brother treats his games like a day off, although she also enjoys spending time with him. After the punishment order was issued, Zhangbin and Jiongong were locked up and sometimes screamed like they were possessed. The crown prince decided to visit them, but the protagonist had no intention of visiting those she disliked. Li Hai had to do things as crown prince, even if he disliked them, but Xia was free to choose. The protagonist heard the screams again. The crown prince covered her ears so the little one wouldn't hear anything. When the sound stopped, Li Hai asked his sister to eat well, see only good things, and think positively. And then he went to visit his brother. Because Li Hai is a maternal relative, he must visit and monitor his life from time to time. A little later, she found out that she would soon have a younger brother or sister. That's why, when Mom tasted the pudding for the first time, something seemed strange to her, and it turned out to be morning sickness. The protagonist was curious to know if it would be a girl or a boy. Maybe a child will be born who looks exactly like the protagonist's younger brother, named Yun Shiwan. Zia decided to congratulate her mother personally. The maids asked the lady how everything went, since Her Highness was probably very happy. The protagonist confirmed these words. Just then, Zia noticed something was wrong with Beak, because he looked a little unwell. It turns out the servant simply didn't understand why the people in the crown prince's palace were so rude. The prince's personal maid ordered her to watch her smile. The protagonist rolled her eyes, because the people of the East Palace detested her. Even today, they looked at her with hostility. But how is it possible that even her servants caused trouble? Of course, Xia couldn't just stand by, as she had a brilliant idea. The heroine offered the crown prince a dessert that the queen had gifted her last time. Elijah became curious, wondering if she had already offered that to her father. She replied negatively, which meant the crown prince tasted the dish long before his father. The protagonist explained that the dish needed a more thorough testing. The crown prince asked if his father wouldn't get upset. Suddenly, the princess revealed that many say she behaves frivolously. Frowning, the crown prince seriously asked if Sangung had told her anything. Xia expected it, but she didn't think the prince would get so angry. Now Li He was beginning to doubt if he had the right to be the crown prince. However, everything was completely different. The prince wasn't like this before. That's why the protagonist didn't understand why he suddenly thought so negatively. She abruptly stood up and asked if anything else had happened yesterday after seeing the second prince. Li He didn't answer, but the protagonist knew how tired he was. The crown prince immediately started hugging the protagonist. Soon he will have to take a princess as a wife. It had been so long since his mother passed away, but he still didn't want to bring another woman home. If she hadn't become the crown princess, perhaps she wouldn't suffer so much or die so young. Xia asked her brother if he wanted to give her a gift. The father still keeps the ring he gifted the princess when he was crown prince. The protagonist revealed that he bought it during a walk among the townspeople. Li Hai, with a warm smile, asked why his Xia was so smart, and the heroine replied that she was simply born that way. The crown prince asked his sister to immediately tell him if her future husband behaved badly, but Xia replied that if she didn't like her husband, she would live alone. However, Li Hai didn't understand how one could live alone while having a husband. The protagonist explained that, when the husband dies, the princess can start living peacefully alone. It sounded like she was plotting something against her husband. The novel said that after the death of the little princesses, the emperor fell into despair and had no other children. And now, besides Xia, the birth of another baby is expected. The prince reminded his sister that they were both members of the imperial family, but Xia decided that if she didn't want to get married, she would simply flee to another island with money the eve of the wedding. Li Hai asked his sister to just tell him if, suddenly, she liked someone. With her arms crossed, the girl replied that she would think about it. Seasons passed like this, and time flowed peacefully. But one day, the empress scolded her very severely. The protagonist told the maids that it was all right, but still asked them not to tell her mother anything. Actually, Xia was ready to be punished for this, so she regrets nothing. She told the empress that the grand prince always tries very hard, so she could be a little kinder to him. After these words, Song Bin took the whip, but it seemed Mom wasn't as angry as she looked. In the end, she even cried and apologized. It seems she punishes her real son more often. Now, the protagonist is in the Gong Hall. However, the crown prince and the third one visited her. With concern, Li He asked his sister if she was all right. He was sure that Xia was punished because of his incompetent brother. The crown prince wouldn't come to the palace without prior notice, so the empress knew he was coming. That's why she scolded the protagonist on purpose. It was a kind of act to show that she was not threatening the heir's position. The crown prince surely heard everything. The protagonist thought the empress had gone too far this time, but not with her. But with her son. From the beginning, Li Hua said nothing, but she was sure he felt it deeply. Originally, officials and non-heir princes had to study culture to maintain appearances, but they had to live under the motto that they are pure and free, and that power and the crown do not interest them at all. But since the crown prince treated Yungwen well, the latter followed his older brother in his studies in martial arts, and the problem is that he surpassed the heir in everything. The grand prince is much younger than the heir, so direct comparisons are impossible. Suddenly, Li He declared that he was a complete failure, and that it would be better for the country if the heir was someone exceptional. But if you change the prince, the elders will unleash a big fight. Even if you have talent, it doesn't mean you are the only one capable of something. After all, this might not lead to anything great. Sometimes Li He thinks about it, but Xia says things improper for a child. It seems he doesn't have to worry about her. The crown prince spoke about the upcoming military maneuvers, for which he plans to leave the palace for a while. They used to be held in spring, but lately they are held in winter. At this time, wild animals approach private homes out of hunger. The protagonist came to the conclusion that the crown prince hunting is out of place. Brushes and books suit her brother better, so Xia didn't understand how to send such a beautiful face to hunt. Suddenly, Li Hai asked his sister to prepare that rice cake for him once more before leaving. It is a new snack created for Concubine Jun, who suffers from morning sickness, and she cannot eat well. It is lighter than rice cake. That's why pregnant women like it. The protagonist promised to prepare it tomorrow. It turns out that even other people, upon hearing about the cake, wanted to try it. Xia looked at her brother suspiciously and asked if he planned to give the leftovers to other people. He looked at the heroine hopefully and asked pitifully if she didn't allow it. But the protagonist was more interested in whether her brother was going to give this snack to the second prince. Lee Hai confessed that he was very worried, because every day his character becomes even fiercer. Now Xia replied that she would think about his proposal. But if my brother promises not to share his plate with anyone, the protagonist will do it. What choice? Li Hua was getting angry. And the crown prince deduced that his brother also wanted to try the cake. When the protagonist talked to the baby, who wasn't born yet, he became super active. We don't know yet if it's a princess or a prince, but this baby is very impatient. Xia asked her mother if she was okay, and the woman replied not to worry about her. The protagonist reminded her that the roads are slippery in winter, and asked for caution when going out. Zhan Xiang approached the crown prince and asked if he was all right. The crown prince washed his face with cold water. He said it was nothing serious, and asked not to give it importance. Immediately after, he pulled an arrow out of the wounded crow. It would have been easier if it had died from the first arrow strike. A huge tiger slowly emerged from the thicket of the forest. Everyone was petrified upon seeing the predatory beast. The crown prince hastily mounted his horse and ordered an immediate retreat. They didn't even have a trap prepared for the tiger. Li Hua and his teacher noticed that His Royal Highness had come to class again. Today, the protagonist brought a bribe with her. She handed her creation to the instructor, telling him to share it with his family. Xia had a hidden reason for attending Grand Prince Zhongyuan's class. The protagonist used the class as an excuse to understand how this world worked. But Li Hua didn't understand why she sat with him during lessons. This world resembles Joseon, which the protagonist knows. But there are differences. For example, some characters are missing. Perhaps that's why Xia was interested in studying history. Children like the third prince, even if obstacles are put in their way, study the material without being distracted by anything. After classes, the protagonists went to play. Li Hua was proud of himself, as his sister couldn't yet rival her brother. Seeing the servants whispering, the protagonist wondered why all the servants were gathered there. The court ladies shuddered when the young lady abruptly asked what was happening. It turned out that a messenger arrived from Gangwon-do with urgent news and hurried to leave. The third prince assumed that if it was urgent, it must be extremely important. The protagonist paused, wondering what could have happened to prompt them to send a messenger from Gangwon-do with such urgency. This might be something the king cannot resolve. Xia abruptly took her brother's hand, saying they had to urgently go to the empress. The princess looked at her brother in horror, upon hearing her say they were about to break etiquette rules. Li Hua was stunned when his sister shouted that they had to hurry. The little one was the first to bang the door open. The officials began to be outraged, because they had ordered that no one be allowed in while meeting with the empress. The third prince apologized to the empress for not having taken proper care of his sister. He was about to leave, however. His Majesty asked him to stay. Grand Prince Yongyuan and Xia were meant to hear this news. Soon everyone knew that the crown prince had died tragically, being devoured by a tiger. The protagonist couldn't believe it. Her brother promised to return. When he was still at home, the crown prince asked his sister to take care of something. It was that same ring the princess talked about before. The heir received it from his father. Li Hei thought that if he took it to the maneuvers, he would surely lose it. As soon as he returned, the prince promised his beloved little sister to bring her something better. It turns out all his words were lies. After this, 1 month passed. The crown prince's funeral ceremony continued, and Xia cried to exhaustion every day, sleeping amidst tears. But one day, she finally left her room. The princess asked the court ladies if they knew where the senior officer was. They said he was completely healthy, but even those rumors couldn't be believed. Zhan Xiang had an injured eye. The man immediately got out of bed, even though His Highness had given him permission not to. The protagonist decided to find out the whole truth from the senior officer, as the others refused to say anything. He hasn't even seen his brother's body, and hasn't been told anything about what happened to him in his final moments. It is even crueler that he has to gather information only through rumors. The crown prince always told his attendant that the lady's stubbornness was invincible. And he was right. It all happened when they were suddenly caught in a heavy snowfall and hurried to return. Because they accelerated, the horse slipped on the snowy path and the prince fell off it. Fortunately, he suffered no serious injuries and was about to remount his horse. But at that moment, as if waiting for the perfect time, a tiger appeared. So, Jian Xiangho guided the crown prince and stayed behind to fight the tiger alone. The predator was old and moved slowly, so the man managed to strike a fatal blow with just his bow. Then, the hero thought he had been lucky, until he discovered those who had advanced in a terrible state. There was another tiger there, Yongxiang. Oh immediately attacked, thinking the predator had cruelly torn apart his highness, the crown prince. He managed to wound the second tiger, but it threw him far away. Under the tiger's blows, Yongxiang lost consciousness and fell, and when he woke up, he saw the tiger's fangs right in front of him, and at that moment, the man thought it was all over. But suddenly, the predator writhed and roared, as if in agony. It turned out that the crown prince, whom Zhang Xiangho believed dead, was nearby with a drawn bow. In other words, the foolish crown prince was risking his life to save his warrior. When Zhang Xiangho opened his eyes again, he realized that now he was the sole survivor. Gathering his last strength, he followed the tiger's tracks, and among the scattered bodies, he saw it wounded and panting. So Jian Xiangho ended the tiger's life, using the sword of his fallen comrade. Afterward, the soldiers found the man, gave him first aid, and with the remaining belongings and clothes, they identified the body. The crown prince held a painting with the image of the grand prince in his hands. And the princess, Li Hai, was always like this, thinking of others, not himself, but the protagonist loved that quality in him. Although Xia felt resentment, she couldn't punish Jian Xiangho, because then the crown prince's death would be in vain. The protagonist headed for the exit and asked the senior officer not to accompany her, but Jian Xiangho didn't agree with that. He insisted on escorting the princess. Upon returning, Beek suspiciously looked at one of the maids. Then, the court lady explained to the princess that she thought she saw a familiar face. The servant revealed that visits to the medical center had increased lately. When Zhongbin heard about the crown prince, she burst into tears, saying she wanted to repay his kindness and say goodbye one last time. But when she was alive, she treated him cruelly and said horrible things to him. Zhang Xiangho told the princess about his plans to resign and leave this post. Xia's eyes widened, and she asked the man if the crown prince didn't desire that outcome. But the man served his highness for years, and now he cannot, nor does he have the right to serve a new master. Xia heard that he risked his life and fought hard for the position of senior officer. Suddenly, Jian Xiangho revealed to the princess that the crown prince longed for her to grow up. He begged the lady to take care of herself, and the protagonist asked the senior officer to do the same for himself. Then, they said goodbye to each other. Officially, the death of the crown prince was announced as an accident due to a horse fall. But rumors were circulating. Recently, gossiping maids whispered that a tiger ate someone, or that they heard strange voices. Beek begged the lady not to answer under any circumstances if she suddenly heard a voice calling her. This means that whoever becomes the tiger's victim transforms into a slave who brings prey. The protagonist turned abruptly as soon as a voice called her by name and asked who was there. From the shadows emerged a huge tiger. The court ladies grabbed the young princess and ran away from the beast. The protagonist didn't understand what was happening. Do ghosts really exist in this world? The maid carrying the princess didn't see a stone in the darkness and stumbled. Losing balance, she fell to the ground. Right above, the protagonist saw the paw of an enormous beast, and surprise, a knife sticking out. But the tiger stopped dead when it heard the guards' voices. The huge predator turned and vanished into the darkness. Jian Songho approached with a doctor to ask the princess if she was all right, and what those screams were about. How lucky that they arrived in time. The protagonist felt a little calmer. Quickly, the palace guard ran towards the heroes. The maids wanted to explain the situation, but Xia ordered them to be quiet. The princess herself explained that a suspect had attacked them and then fled. As soon as the servants left, Beek asked his lady if they shouldn't report to the guard, but Xia replied that that voice was different. She wouldn't mistake her brother's voice. In all that chaos, only she could see it clearly. But the way that Tiger walked was unnatural. It moved as if a human were inside. And most importantly, in the moonlight, the princess saw something shining. It wasn't beast claws. Therefore, this is the work of a human. It's strange for a little girl to say that. But the protagonist didn't have time to think now. Everyone in the palace already knows that the crown prince died in a tiger accident, so the rumors will only get worse. Suddenly, Ami ran towards the princess. Hastily, she begged her mistress to go immediately to see her highness, Concubine Jun. It turns out the lady has started bleeding heavily. Ami grabbed the doctor's hand and dragged him to the lady's quarters. The protagonist, scared by everything that was happening, asked the servant what happened for her mother to suddenly start bleeding. Before the lady had dinner and drank the medicinal infusion, everything was fine with her. But suddenly, a young male voice resonated calling Lady Jun. The protagonist immediately asked if she was sure it was a human voice, and the court lady replied affirmatively. Then something strange attacked the lady, and she, very frightened, fell, causing a hemorrhage. Shia didn't understand who dared to do something like that to her sister. It turns out that lately, the lady said her belly had turned like a stone. It was possibly due to worries about the crown prince, as she felt sick throughout the ceremony. After taking the medicinal potion, she only got worse. So Beek went to the royal hospital several times, but after examining her, they said it was simply due to stress. Her sister's voice had never sounded so distressed. The birth was advanced by 3 months, but if something goes wrong, not only will the baby suffer, but her sister's life will be in danger. The concubine kept screaming, and Shia could no longer bear to hear it. But suddenly, the screams began to gradually fade. Torrential tears burst from the protagonist's eyes upon hearing the doctor call the lady in panic. The princess dashed out instantly. She opened the door violently and saw terrified maids begging the lady to open her eyes. Jun slowly lifted her eyelids and looked at Shia. The protagonist touched her hand, and the woman whispered that she was very happy she had come. She was so happy to be close to her only daughter in her last moment. The concubine's eyelids closed, and her heart stopped beating. The protagonist hugged her sister and screamed in despair, not understanding why everything ended this way. Both her brother and sister, for some reason, are all abandoning her. In the end, the protagonist lost consciousness again and woke up in her room to several voices. The emperor ordered a discreet funeral to be prepared for concubine Jun. Afterward, the maids whispered that without the baby in her womb, none of this would have happened. Surely, in the original story, her sister wouldn't have died. But the protagonist changed destiny. The crown prince also could not escape his fateful destiny and ultimately died. Perhaps everything she did was in vain. Upon opening her eyes, the protagonist saw Beek and Ami right in front of her. Shia sat up in bed and asked directly how her mother's baby was. From the maid's reaction, she understood that the little one had not survived. Shia longed to take care of the baby when it was born and dreamed of seeing it grow up healthy. The protagonist burst into tears again, while Ami tried to comfort her. The servant recounted that His Majesty came in person and looked after her for days before leaving. It turns out that Jongbin and Kyungwon also came to see her, but the maids intentionally stopped them so they wouldn't cause trouble. They brought an infusion to the princess's room. Suddenly, the protagonist remembered that, since the crown prince's funeral, her sister worsened after drinking that infusion. During that time, the maids from Cheongdan started entering the royal infirmary, which makes it very likely that everything was planned. But the infusions have already been destroyed, so now there is no evidence. Even if an autopsy could somehow be performed, it would be difficult to prove the presence of poison. The servant Beek begged her mistress to rest and not think too much. But the protagonist hasn't eaten or moved for days, so it's time for her to start recovering. During these days, Zia received many visits. The emperor and empress, Grand Prince Yongwon, and even the concubines sent people to find out how she was doing. But among all those people, those whom the protagonist truly wished to see were absent. Several days passed, and only when the court physician said she was better could Shia leave the sanatorium. The first place she went was the room where she lived with her sister. Everything there remained almost the same, but now one person was missing. Her sister's grave was outside the palace, so the protagonist couldn't even visit her. The protagonist's eyes widened upon hearing her sister's voice, calling her name. And then, right in front of her, Shia saw her, crying loudly and heartbroken over the loss of a loved one. Upon seeing the photograph, the protagonist understood that it was about her own funeral. Shia approached her sister, and the woman grabbed her hand abruptly, saying with a bloody mouth that this was unfair. The protagonist jolted up from the bed, woken by a nightmare. It's just a dream, but tears started to flow again. For some reason, only now had she had such a dream. Shia decided to get some fresh air, put on a cloak, and silently went out to the street while the other maids slept. Because the guard was focused on protecting Grand Prince Yongwon, Shia was able to leave without problems. Actually, she didn't understand why she had come to Cheongdan, but the protagonist froze. As soon as a familiar voice asked someone if the matter had gone well, Shia immediately crouched down and hid so that no one would discover her. As the second prince ordered, one of Grand Prince Jongwon's maids was eliminated. The court lady is supposed to put something in Jongwoo's food, but Quinnan didn't explain what it was. As the prince promised, as soon as she gets out of here, the maid will become a concubine. And no more errands. In other words, Quinnan plans to poison Grand Prince Jongwoo. We must urgently inform the prince before they poison him for real. Seeing the servant running away, the protagonist miraculously hid and was not seen. When the noise subsided, Zia decided to follow her immediately. Unexpectedly, Quinnan asked someone to come out and then said it had to be done silently. If he fails and Yanggu doesn't die, let him live in fear of poisoning his whole life. If Quinnan had been crowned immediately, he wouldn't even resort to so many deaths. The death of the older brother was just an opportunity for Quinnan, and now everything fits. He posed as a tiger to turn his brother into a monster, and poisoned his sister Xia to take the throne. A man asked the prince why he had left the princess alive, but Quinnan was sure. A creature as pathetic as the princess could not be an obstacle, and would soon beg for mercy. Besides, her food is quite good. Now the protagonist understood why he had left her alive. The Grand Prince was very surprised when Zia found him. The protagonist rushed into the room and was happy to see that her brother was alive. Yangwen took her hands between his and asked worriedly why she was so cold and thinly dressed. And then, the prince assumed his sister had run there after a nightmare that wouldn't let her sleep alone. The protagonist lied, saying that was the case. Jongwoo smiled warmly when the princess asked him to stay the whole night. Xia lay down, and the prince said he couldn't sleep and wanted to read a book. The protagonist saw prunes on the table, and Jongwoo said they were brought to him. But he didn't want them. The princess asked to try one, and Jongwoo, of course, allowed her. It turns out the prince is studying, because without it, bad thoughts torment him. After the incident with his older brother, Yongwoo wants to visit and take better care of Xia. She was so happy to know she would have a younger brother. That's why the prince will take even better care of her. Suddenly, he remembered the scene where his sister asks for another prune, and upon turning, he sees a ghost with its mouth full of blood. Yongwoo didn't understand why he suddenly remembered that. But just in case, the Grand Prince decided to turn to look at Xia. The little one's entire mouth was stained with blood. She closed her eyes while the prince jumped from his spot. He hugged her and shouted for them to call a doctor. With her last strength, Xia blurted out that, since they were at it, he should be a good ruler. Jongwon's eyes opened enormously, and the protagonist lost consciousness. The Grand Prince began to cry loudly, clutching his loved one painfully against his chest, shouting her name. On the night of the incident, the princess woke up her maids and asked them to follow her to where Grand Prince Yongyuan was. She ordered that they must capture the person who would ask them to stop, and that they must not let him escape under any circumstances. After that, he must be immediately taken to the inner courtyard. If the court ladies said it was an order from the princess, His Majesty the Empress would take care of everything else. She begged the girls not to worry about her. However, she now lay exhausted in bed. After ingesting the poison, Ami couldn't believe her mistress had really come to this. Time passed and there was Ami, once again, carrying food down the hallway, prepared for the princess. Upon entering, she discovered that her mistress was fully conscious and no longer seemed so sick. Tears flowed on their own from Ami's eyes. Shortly after, the emperor rushed to Xia. He hugged his daughter tightly, for the first time in a long time, because he was incredibly happy that she was well. The man didn't understand how he could torment his father's heart like that. Following His Majesty, the Empress came running, very worried, as soon as she learned the princess had woken up. The doctors said it was a true miracle that the lady survived in that state. Zia wanted to ask what happened after that day, but the atmosphere was so heavy that she couldn't open her mouth. To be honest, it was scarier than an angry father. The silent Grand Prince Yongwoo, simply sitting, without saying a single word. He stayed even after the Emperor and Empress left, and finally spoke, making Zia shudder. Agitation and disapproval could be read in his gaze. He wanted to say something, but retracted it instantly and asked his sister to rest. Although in his presence she couldn't do it. It turns out that Jaihong Wu has now become the crown prince. Zia congratulated him, and then her brother exclaimed that it was pointless, because she had been on the verge of death the whole time. Yanggu asked if she could even imagine what he felt seeing her cough up blood. And now Zia acts as if nothing happened. The protagonist hugged her brother and apologized, saying it was her fault. Yang Yuan hugged her tightly and cried for the first time in a long time. Honestly, Zia didn't even think about him, and the prince suffered as much as she did. Yangbin pulled his sister aside a little and asked indignantly if she knew there was poison in those snacks. He perfectly remembered that she had apologized to him. Moreover, she came to his chambers alone, without the court ladies, who finally captured the maid who brought the persimmon. Normally, Yongbin was always slow, but here he suddenly became perceptive. Calming down, the prince said that not even she would consciously take poison. So she was just talking nonsense. The prince said he had been confused by the testimony of the maid who brought the persimmon. At first, the girl denied knowing anything, but Xia was on the verge of death, so she had to interrogate her with unkind methods. In the end, she confessed to altering Prince Qianan's medicine, but swore she didn't know what it was. Do we believe her? It was then confirmed that she was telling the truth. Poison was found in the second prince's room. How convenient. And apart from the poisoning attempt, even murkier things were uncovered. It turns out they were casting curses against the brother in the mansion. What a level of resentment. In this era, curses are not just superstitions, so it's better not to take them lightly. The father became furious and was ready to execute the culprits instantly. What a temper. But they were still mourning the older brother. And too many tragedies had already followed one after another. So Qianan was stripped of his title and sent into exile. Goodbye, little prince. And behind him, the officials from the left minister's circle were also exiled. The whole mafia fell. That devastated Xia. And then her brother added that they were sent to different regions for forced exile. It is a punishment where the prisoner was locked behind a wall so high that light could not penetrate. The only connection to the outside world was a small hole through which food was passed. The protagonist's eyes opened enormously when her brother asked if she was all right. Xia smiled warmly and replied yes. Spring soon arrived. Songbirds chirped happily, and the warm sun rays and cool breeze greeted Xia. But to the protagonist's great regret, she felt not the slightest happiness for having survived. The princess was informed that the crown prince was looking for her. Shortly after recovering her health, this title was officially assigned to the protagonist. But what was unexpected was that the emperor, the empress, and the crown prince constantly sent people to Xia. The protagonist didn't understand if her brother had called her just for a meal. As she imagined, Zhongwen's invitations were not like the others. The crown prince didn't understand why his sister grew so slowly, as if avoiding meals on purpose. Xia wasn't gaining the necessary weight, and this started to worry Zhongwen. According to the doctor, the protagonist's body weakened due to poisoning. But her health is fine. Today, Xia heard that in the palace, they were starting to choose a bride for the crown prince. And Zhongwen shuddered at those words. Actually, the prince didn't want that. The protagonist exclaimed that it was the wisdom of the elders, aimed at the well-being of her older brother. If this little one keeps hearing strange things, perhaps Zhongwen should force the princess's maids to be quiet. Suddenly, the prince asked when she planned to start studying, as he knew she had talent in mathematics. It turns out she wanted to lighten the crown prince's workload, so she introduced Arabic numerals and statistical tables. The protagonist didn't want to answer the prince's question, so she ran away. She decided to take a walk, because now she felt a little more relieved. The princess stopped dead upon suddenly hearing a small childish voice. It was an unknown boy who, pay attention, called the protagonist very beautiful. The protagonist approached him and asked the little one, curiously, where he had come from. The boy said he came with his sister and aunt because his father had distinguished himself in battle. An invitation as a reward. Then, the boy enthusiastically asked the heroine who she was, because she was too pretty to be a maid. She asked, slightly uncomfortable, if there was perhaps a rule forbidding maids from being beautiful. She decided to change the subject and asked her new acquaintance, shouldn't he be looking for his family? The young man exclaimed excitedly. Now that he's reached the palace, he doesn't want to leave so soon. Besides, there are some very beautiful maids here. The protagonist extended her hand to the boy and proposed to show him around the imperial palace a little. The boy was fascinated by the beauty of the palace. It had been a long time since the protagonist had spoken so openly with someone, not counting the current crown prince. Suddenly, the new acquaintance's stomach let out a loud roar. In the end, the children went to look for cassella, which they had secretly taken from the pastry shop a little earlier. The protagonist told the boy that this egg and rice cake is the talk of the town right now. The little one was delighted with that taste. As soon as the boys finished eating, the protagonist decided to take her new friend back to the palace with his relatives. But suddenly, a huge black crow appeared above the princess. The boy immediately hugged she, saving her from the bird's sudden attack. But it turned out the crow didn't have that intention. He held the bird with one hand and asked if it was all right, surprising the heroine. It turned out that a string was stuck in the crow's leg, which is why it couldn't fly properly. The heroine thanked the boy for catching the bird and preventing it from losing something important. Ever since her older brother gave her that ring, Zia never took it off and cherished it dearly. Upon hearing that, the boy squeezed the bird tighter and shamelessly called out to it. But the boys released the crow, telling it not to dare return or it would pay the consequences. Upon turning her head, she accidentally kissed the boy on the cheek. She immediately moved away and began to apologize, because everything happened completely by accident. The boy's face turned bright red and he started to stutter. The little one decided to hold his breath on purpose, and then the protagonist saw the boy's bleeding wound. Most likely, a magpie had just wounded him, but it's not that serious, although the wound still needs to be cleaned. There was nothing nearby, so Shia gave him her handkerchief and bandaged her new acquaintance's hand. Actually, the protagonist was surprised by this boy's courage, and the boy said he inherited that quality from his father. Thanks to his exceptional combat skills, the father managed to become an army commander. A sudden guess invaded the protagonist, and she got up abruptly. The boy said he came here with his sister, so Zia found out she is 14 years old. That is the same age as the crown prince, which means she is the candidate for Jong-won's wife. The protagonist grabbed the boy's hand and, without explanation, dragged him with her. The crown prince asked the girl if she would become his fiancée. However, she had not the slightest desire to be the crown prince's fiancée. Even from 100 meters away, it was clear that she was the protagonist. Shia couldn't look away. Actually, this girl wanted to be a doctor. Her mother was sick, but at that time, it was common for women's illnesses not to be treated properly. That's why that woman soon passed away, which was a heavy burden for the protagonist. The girl was sure that the crown prince would say that a woman couldn't do that. But surprisingly, Jong-un replied that if a noblewoman became a doctor, it would be easier for the others. It was the first time the protagonist heard those words. Perhaps those thoughts came to the crown prince thanks to his younger sister. Zia is smart, but sometimes unpredictable and whimsical. Jong-un gently touched the girl's hand and tenderly told her that he needed the crown princess very much right now. Therefore, he kindly asked the protagonist to think about it one more time. Shia understood immediately. Now her brother was using her beauty as a weapon. It seems the crown prince realized he needs to marry as soon as possible to strengthen his position. Hisshin couldn't stand this scene and ran to his sister. His sister immediately asked her brother worriedly where he had been all this time, because she couldn't find him anywhere. She didn't understand how her brother had managed to get all those injuries, and where he suddenly got a white handkerchief from. The crown prince was stunned when he saw Shia. The protagonist emerged from her hiding place and awkwardly replied to the crown prince that it was an accident. Sachin's sister froze upon seeing the princess. With a smile, the crown prince introduced his sister, Princess Shia. Surprise appeared on Sachin's face, mixed with astonishment at who she had been with all this time. The girl immediately apologized to the princess. She said her name was Kim Jae-hyua, and the boy introduced himself as Suchin. Now that Kim Jae-hyua found her younger brother, she had to leave, so she thanked the crown prince for the time. But she clearly didn't know the palace, so Jong-won couldn't let her go alone, and offered to accompany her. And she accepted. After the incident with the dried persimmon, the prince's distrust of people increased. But now he seemed quite active. Jong-won proposed again to Kim Jae-hwa to be the crown princess, and she kindly replied that the strict castle laws were not for her. She loves freedom and enjoying festivals in any season. Unlike her, the crown prince never left the palace. And now it's much harder. But still, he invited Kim Jae-hwa to personally show her the Lantern Festival that will be held soon. The girl instantly blushed. She didn't expect something like this, but she accepted the invitation. The protagonist remembered a crucial detail mentioned in the original novel. Yeon Bin's adoptive father plans to destroy the Jae-hwa family, accusing her of treason to curb the prince. Although Jae-hwa escaped in the chaos, her whole family was captured, and in the end it was written that they all died. After the incident with Jongbin and Prince Jeonggong, Hong Sang-jo also resigned. But there is no time to relax. What happened in the original story, in the end, ended up happening here too. Zia whispered to her new friend that, on the 4th day of the 4th moon, he must follow his sister if she went anywhere. The protagonist explained that she also plans to go to that place. And soon, that day finally arrived. Our heroes set off for the long-awaited celebration. At that very moment, the officials begged His Majesty to act, as this crime must be seen as treason. The emperor ordered all the culprits to be arrested. Suchin asked the princess if she liked dried persimmons, as they say they are delicious. She guiltily replied that she didn't like that, but instead, she proposed going together to buy honey cookies. The crown prince smiled warmly, as he was pleased to see the children's joy. On the way, the heroes ran into a shadow theater. Suchin took the princess's hand and pulled her behind him, wishing to watch the show together. The protagonist was horrified to suddenly see a man in a tiger mask appear right in front of her. And she froze. Suchin noticed the princess's strange reaction. Therefore, he suggested returning, claiming it wasn't as interesting as he thought. Stepping aside, the boy promised the protagonist that he would always protect her from any danger. Xia smiled and replied that she would count on him. The crown prince bought lanterns and proposed they go up to the wall to launch them together. The protagonist replied that she was tired and wanted to rest a bit. And Suchin said the same. Actually, Xia knew that her brother had come to be with Jihua, not to look after her. In the original story, that girl will survive, so there is nothing to worry about, since Jiangwen will be nearby. A little later, the princess and her friend arrived at the house Jihua rents every year for the Lantern Festival. Now, it seems we can finally breathe a sigh of relief. Actually, the protagonist was very nervous, but they had fun until their feet burned. But this is much better than everything remaining the same at the end of the Lantern Festival. Natural disasters like the tiger attack, Xia couldn't prevent, but perhaps they overcame the critical point now. In the distance, our heroes heard the sound of fireworks. They say that on the Han River, students launch boats and put on a fire show. That's why Suchin proposed going there together later, and the protagonist promised him. Suddenly, a servant came running with bad news. It turns out the lord is accused of treason. Suchin jumped up and said with a trembling voice that it was impossible, that his father would never do such a thing. The protagonist didn't understand why this happened, since Hong Sang-jo no longer had a reason. Suchin shouted that he would not flee until verifying everything one more time. But Xia hit him on the head with all her strength, and then she shouted that she needed to recover as soon as possible, because her life was in danger now. Xia approached one of the servants asking his name, and discovered it was Dachil. The princess ordered him to immediately climb the wall and deliver the message, as he knew best where the lady might have gone. The protagonist advised that it would be better to exit through the south gate, cross the Han River by ferry, and circle the city. Therefore, she asked Dagshil to quickly convey that they would meet at the crossing. Then, Xia asked her court ladies if they had taken warm clothes, and immediately received an affirmative answer. Suchin shuddered as soon as the princess ordered him to undress. In the end, they dressed him as a girl. Now, surely the guards grab all the boys and search, so it is urgent to change his appearance. Beak decided to tie up the master's hair. Actually, the protagonist thought the maids would try to stop her. But Beak, with a warm smile, replied that whatever happened, they would obey their mistress. It was obvious that, if they were caught, many would regret it. Then, the protagonist gave Suchin the sweets she had brought, and asked him to tell everyone that she was the daughter of a noble family strolling with her maid. Besides, Xia took out jewelry and gave it to her friend so he could sell it and not starve to death. To top it off, the protagonist advised Suchin not to completely trust his servants. Seeing the sadness on the boy's face, she promised to accompany him to the south gate. Suddenly, Suchin asked the protagonist why she worried so much about him. Xia explained that he was still a child and had done nothing wrong. Being the son of a traitor is hard, but now the important thing is to flee. The rest will be thought of later. Calming down, Suchin agreed with the princess's words. The protagonist decided to ask her friend if it was true that he knew how to ride a horse. Precisely that was what the servant Dachil, lurking, managed to overhear. In a short time, a horse with a rider on its back approached the gates. The guard did not react. He only thought about how much that silk dress would cost. Suddenly, Dachil ran forward and shouted that this boy in a skirt on horseback was actually the fugitive son of the traitor. The guards began to doubt the veracity of the information. So Dachil decided to test it. He ran to the rider and ripped off the silk fabric, hoping for mercy. But under the cloak was the princess, who looked at the traitor with contempt. She struck the man's hand and exclaimed how dare he even touch her. If he claims she is the daughter of a traitor, he must answer for his words. The guard decided to release the lady, but Dachil couldn't allow it, so he grabbed the horse's tail. But the man didn't expect at all that the animal would kick him with its hind legs. Suddenly, the horse reared up and bolted, terrifying the protagonist. Ami slapped Dachil in the face, called him a scoundrel, and shouted that if anything happened to the lady, he wouldn't leave alive. At that moment, Suchin was stealthily carried away on someone's back. He was also terrified to see the horse carrying the princess away. Suchin remembered Princess Xia's strong hug and her promise that everything would be fine. The boy promised to survive and repay the princess for her kindness. After entering the forest, the horse finally stopped and the protagonist congratulated it. Who would have thought that idiot would get so close and provoke Chuck? A little earlier, the protagonist explained that she would ride Sock to distract, while the servant carried Suchin away on his back. Beak will take the horse Ami brought and take it to the minor west gate. He will hand it over and leave silently. But Ami asked her mistress to wait and offered her other clothes, as the current ones could be dangerous. That servant Doc Chill saw the blue clothes and ran after her. If it weren't for Ami, everything could have ended very badly. Most likely Jihua didn't hear about the meeting at the pier, so Zia didn't know if she would be all right. Surely the crown prince was with her and helped her escape. But here is the interesting part. Who framed the Jihua family, accusing them of conspiracy? In the original story, during the discovery of a conspiracy plotted by other groups, Hong Sangjo took the opportunity and tried to involve Lord Kim Seongjik, head of Hamgyong province, in the conspiracy but failed. However, Jinhan and Hong Sangjo already fell, so someone else is behind this, or the first ones still have influence. But today it is better not to think about it, because the protagonist did everything she could. At least, she saved those she could save. Suddenly, 3 men appeared in front of her and told the girl they knew her parents well. It was obvious nonsense that Xia immediately exposed. The protagonist told the bandits that her mother had died many years ago, and that she had no relatives, as she was an orphan. Then, the bandit demanded she share her money or valuables, claiming to know her mother. But Xia apologized, replying that she had already given all her money to someone else. The men became frustrated, realizing some strange guy had tricked the little one. Then the bandit pointed at the horse, saying that would serve too. But the protagonist explained that it was the last thing her deceased brother had left her. Who saved the poor animal? The bandits were stunned by the young woman's tragic fate. Tears welled up in Xia's eyes, and the men hastily explained that they only wanted to earn some money. They decided to leave the horse alone, but asked the girl to take off her clothes. The protagonist immediately exclaimed, asking if they were perverts. A quiet giggle echoed nearby. From the shadows emerged a man, saying that the situation didn't look so threatening. So he was thinking of walking by, but intimidating a young woman to tears. That was definitely not right. The gang leader was happy, as with an adult he could act differently than with a girl. But the stranger defeated him with a single blow. The protagonist didn't understand where such a master had appeared from. Once the savior took care of everyone, he asked the young woman if she was heading to the south gate. The stranger warned that he would go ahead, and asked the young woman to keep her distance and follow him. The protagonist, with a warm smile, thanked him for his help. In a short time, they reached the desired place. Since the young woman's escorts were already waiting for her, the savior decided to say goodbye. The protagonist thanked him and finally managed to glimpse his face a little. The man left, and the protagonist explained to Beak that he had brought her here. The crown prince felt great relief, seeing his sister return safe. In sound, he immediately got on the horse with her. Jongwon recounted that a servant came to see them and told Jiwa to flee. So they are surely outside the capital. The prince, without even knowing the details, helped them escape. A warm smile appeared on Jongwon's face when the princess confirmed to him that she did the right thing. That day, Zai forgot the most important thing. She couldn't find the ring her deceased brother had given her.